He'd rolled out of his small apartment in Queens at 4:30 a.m., grabbed a coffee and an egg sandwich from the bodega on the corner where Miguel knew his order by heart, and made the familiar drive through the empty streets to the freight terminal in Long Island City where his truck was parked among dozens of other rigs in the secured lot. The load was routine, 45,000 pounds of consumer electronics bound for a warehouse in Buffalo, cargo that required no special handling but paid well enough to keep Elmer's bills current and his retirement savings growing steadily toward the day when he could finally hang up his keys and enjoy what was left of his golden years. Elmer had started trucking later than most drivers, coming to the profession at 35 after a failed marriage and a series of dead-end jobs had left him looking for something that would get him away from the complications of stationary life. The open road had provided exactly the kind of solitude and independence he'd been seeking, allowing him to earn a decent living while avoiding the interpersonal drama that had made his previous life unbearable. 15 years later, he'd perfected a routine that maximized his earnings while minimizing his contact with people who might complicate his carefully ordered existence. By 6:15 a.m., Elmer was rolling north through the Bronx, timing his departure to miss the worst of the morning rush hour traffic that could add hours to his delivery schedule and eat into the profit margins that made his independent operation viable. His Peterbilt was running perfectly, the engine purring with the satisfied rumble of a machine that had been maintained with religious precision according to a schedule that Elmer followed more faithfully than most people followed their medication routines. The morning weather forecast promised clear skies and moderate temperatures for the entire route to western New York, perfect conditions for maintaining the steady pace that would get him to Buffalo with time to spare. The cab of Elmer's truck represented the closest thing to a home that he'd known since his divorce, equipped with a comfortable sleeper berth, a small refrigerator stocked with his favorite foods, and a collection of audiobooks that helped pass the long hours of highway driving. He'd customized the interior with photographs of the landscapes he'd encountered during his travels, creating a mobile gallery of America's scenic beauty that reminded him why he'd chosen this solitary profession over the conventional alternatives that most men his age pursued. Everything was proceeding exactly according to plan, which was exactly how Elmer preferred his trips to unfold. He'd calculated his fuel stops, planned his rest breaks, and even identified backup routes in case construction or accidents forced him to deviate from his primary path. The predictability of his routine provided a sense of security and control that had been missing from his life before he discovered trucking, and he protected that stability with the fierce dedication of someone who'd learned the hard way that chaos and unpredictability led to heartache and financial ruin. The first sign that this wouldn't be an ordinary run came when Elmer reached the junction of Interstate 287 and Interstate 87, about 2 hours into his journey through increasingly rural terrain that stretched away from the urbanized corridor surrounding New York City. Traffic was lighter than usual for a Tuesday morning, with long stretches of empty highway that allowed him to maintain his preferred cruising speed of 65 miles per hour while monitoring his fuel consumption and engine performance through the digital displays that provided real-time data about every aspect of his truck's operation. The fall foliage was beginning to show the first hints of color change, transforming the Hudson Valley landscape into the kind of scenic postcard view that had originally drawn him to long-haul trucking more than a decade and a half earlier. The maples were showing touches of red and gold, while the oaks maintained their summer green with just enough variation to suggest the dramatic transformation that would unfold over the coming weeks. Elmer had driven this route hundreds of times, but he still appreciated the seasonal changes that marked the passage of time and provided visual interest during the long hours behind the wheel. It was just north of Newburgh, at a spot where the highway curved around a hill that provided a panoramic view of the Hudson River Valley, that Elmer first noticed the woman standing beside the highway. She appeared to be in her 40s, wearing a navy blue dress that looked expensive but somehow out of place on the side of a busy interstate. Her dark hair was styled in a way that suggested she'd recently left an office or business meeting, and she was holding a small leather purse in one hand while extending her thumb in the universal gesture of a hitchhiker seeking a ride. What struck Elmer as unusual was her composure. Most people stranded on the highway displayed signs of distress or urgency, pacing nervously or waving frantically at passing vehicles in desperate attempts to attract attention. But this woman stood with the patient confidence of someone who expected to be helped, as if she had absolute faith that the right driver would eventually recognize her need for assistance and stop to provide it. Her posture was relaxed but alert, and even from a distance, Elmer could see that she was watching the approaching traffic with the kind of focused attention that suggested she was evaluating each potential ride, rather than simply hoping for rescue. The location where she stood was also puzzling. Elmer knew this stretch of highway well, and he couldn't recall any businesses, residences, or parking areas in the immediate vicinity that might explain how a well-dressed woman had ended up stranded on the shoulder without any visible vehicle nearby. The nearest exit was several miles away, and the terrain on both sides of the highway consisted of wooded hills that would be difficult to navigate on foot, especially for someone wearing what appeared to be business attire and professional shoes. Elmer's first instinct was to follow his established policy and continue driving without slowing down. He'd seen thousands of hitchhikers over the years, and he'd never once stopped to offer assistance, understanding that the liability and safety risks far outweighed any moral obligation he might feel to help a fellow traveler in need. The trucking industry was full of horror stories about drivers who'd picked up the wrong passenger and lived to regret their moment of compassion, assuming they lived at all. Professional drivers who survived long careers learned to mind their own business and avoid unnecessary complications that could jeopardize their safety or their livelihoods. The woman didn't fit the profile of the typical hitchhiker that Elmer had learned to avoid during his 15 years on the road. She wasn't carrying the backpack or duffel bag that suggested a transient lifestyle, and her professional appearance indicated someone with the resources to arrange proper transportation rather than depending on the kindness of strangers. Most hitchhikers displayed signs of desperation or substance abuse that made them obviously dangerous passengers, but this woman looked like someone who belonged in a corporate boardroom rather than on the side of a highway. But something about this particular woman made him hesitate. Perhaps it was the incongruity of her business attire in such a remote location, or the fact that there was no broken-down vehicle visible anywhere nearby to explain how she'd ended up stranded on the side of Interstate 87. Most hitchhikers carried backpacks or duffel bags suggesting a journey in progress, but this woman had only a small purse, as if she'd stepped out of her normal life and found herself beside the highway without any preparation or planning for an extended trip. The mystery deepened when Elmer considered the timing of her appearance. It was mid-morning on a Tuesday, not exactly prime time for business travel or social activities that might explain why a professionally dressed woman would be traveling alone in a remote area. The nearest cities were hours away, and the small towns along this route didn't contain the kind of businesses or institutions that would require the services of someone who appeared to be a corporate executive or professional consultant. As Elmer's truck approached the woman's position, he found himself slowing down despite his better judgment and 15 years of experience that had taught him to avoid exactly this kind of situation. Through his driver's side mirror, he watched her face as he passed, noting that she didn't display the disappointed expression that most rejected hitchhikers showed when a potential ride failed to stop. Instead, she seemed to be watching his truck with a kind of knowing patience, as if she understood something about his journey that he didn't understand himself. The image of her calm, expectant face stayed in Elmer's mind as he continued north, creating a nagging sense of unfinished business that grew stronger with each passing mile. He found himself checking his mirrors repeatedly, half expecting to see her walking along the shoulder behind him, though he knew that would be impossible given the distance he'd traveled since passing her location. The memory of her patient composure contrasted sharply with his own growing agitation about his decision to drive past without offering assistance. For the next 20 minutes, Elmer wrestled with competing impulses that reflected the fundamental conflict between his practical experience and his moral upbringing. His mother had raised him to help others when he had the ability to do so, instilling values of charity and compassion that had been tested but not eliminated by the harsh realities of adult life. The woman beside the highway had looked genuinely stranded and potentially vulnerable, the kind of person his mother would have expected him to assist, regardless of the personal inconvenience or potential risks involved. On the other hand, Elmer's 15 years of professional trucking had taught him that good intentions could lead to catastrophic consequences when applied without proper judgment and caution. He'd heard too many stories about drivers who'd picked up hitchhikers only to be robbed, assaulted, or worse, by passengers who'd seemed harmless until they'd gained access to the victim's truck cab. The professional trucking community was filled with cautionary tales about drivers whose careers had been destroyed by momentary lapses in judgment that had seemed like simple acts of human kindness. 20 minutes later, Elmer made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He pulled his truck over at the next rest area and sat in his cab for nearly 10 minutes, wrestling with the voice of caution that had kept him safe for 15 years of highway driving while fighting against the growing conviction that he'd made a mistake by not stopping to help someone who genuinely needed assistance. The woman's image wouldn't leave his thoughts, and he found himself remembering not just his mother's teachings about helping others, but also his own experiences of being stranded and ignored by passing motorists during his early years as a driver. Finally, against every instinct he'd developed as a professional driver, Elmer turned his truck around and drove back toward the spot where he'd seen the hitchhiker. The decision felt both inevitable and terrifying, as if he were surrendering to forces beyond his control while simultaneously taking responsibility for consequences he couldn't predict. The return trip seemed to take forever, with each mile increasing his anxiety about what he might find when he reached his destination. The woman was still there, standing in exactly the same position with the same patient composure that had first caught his attention. As Elmer brought his truck to a stop on the shoulder of the highway, she approached his passenger door with a graceful stride that suggested she'd been expecting him to return. Her movement was smooth and confident, without the hurried urgency that most stranded motorists displayed when a potential rescue finally materialized. When she climbed into his cab, Elmer was struck by how normal she seemed. Her voice was cultured and pleasant, with just a hint of a New York accent that suggested she was a local resident rather than a transient traveler passing through the region. Her clothing, which had looked expensive from a distance, proved to be well-tailored and recently cleaned, reinforcing the impression that she was a successful professional rather than someone whose lifestyle might make her a dangerous passenger. "Thank you so much for stopping," she said, settling into the passenger seat with the kind of comfortable familiarity that suggested she'd ridden in truck cabs before. "I'm Bernice Coleman. I'm trying to get to Albany, and I've been having the most terrible time with transportation today." Elmer introduced himself and explained that Albany was directly on his route to Buffalo, so dropping her off there wouldn't cause any delay in his delivery schedule or require him to deviate from his planned path. Bernice smiled gratefully and launched into an explanation of her situation that seemed perfectly reasonable and consistent with her professional appearance. She was a marketing consultant who'd been visiting a client in the Hudson Valley when her rental car had broken down due to what sounded like a routine mechanical failure. According to Bernice's account, the towing service had taken the vehicle to a repair shop, but the earliest she could get a replacement car was the following day. She had an important presentation in Albany that afternoon, and missing it would cost her firm a significant contract that represented months of work and substantial financial compensation. The story was detailed and plausible, with specific references to business relationships and logistical challenges that demonstrated familiarity with the professional consulting industry. As they merged back into traffic and continued north toward Albany, Bernice proved to be excellent company. She was well-educated and articulate, with interesting stories about her work with various corporations and her travels around the northeastern United States. Her conversation revealed sophisticated knowledge of business practices, marketing strategies, and corporate culture that impressed Elmer and made him glad he'd decided to offer her a ride. She asked thoughtful questions about Elmer's experience as a truck driver, displaying genuine curiosity about the challenges and rewards of long-haul freight transportation that went beyond the superficial interest most people showed in his profession. Her questions demonstrated understanding of the technical and logistical complexities involved in commercial trucking, suggesting either professional experience with transportation issues or simply the kind of intelligent curiosity that characterized successful consultants. For the first time in years, Elmer found himself enjoying the company of a passenger, and he began to think that maybe his long-standing policy against hitchhikers had been overly cautious. Bernice's presence transformed the routine drive into an engaging conversation that made the miles pass more quickly and pleasantly than usual. Her insights into business and marketing provided intellectual stimulation that Elmer rarely experienced during his solitary travels, and he found himself hoping that the drive to Albany would take longer than usual so he could continue learning from her expertise. The conversation flowed easily as they drove through the autumn landscape, with Bernice pointing out landmarks and sharing local history about the communities they passed. She seemed to know the Hudson Valley intimately, describing restaurants, hotels, and attractions with the kind of detailed knowledge that comes from years of familiarity with a region. Her descriptions were so vivid and specific that they painted mental pictures of places and events that made Elmer feel as though he were experiencing them firsthand, rather than simply hearing about them secondhand. When they passed through Kingston, she mentioned having attended college in the area, and her descriptions of campus life in the 1990s were so vivid and specific that Elmer found himself feeling nostalgic for his own college years, even though he'd never actually attended university. Her memories of professors, classmates, and campus traditions created a sense of shared experience that seemed to connect them despite their different backgrounds and life experiences. It was during their discussion of education and career choices that Elmer began to notice small inconsistencies in Bernice's stories that gradually transformed his initial comfort with his passenger into something approaching unease. The details that had initially impressed him with their specificity and authenticity started to reveal contradictions and anachronisms that suggested something was fundamentally wrong with either his perception or her account of her life and experiences. When she mentioned graduating from college in 1998, her physical appearance seemed inconsistent with someone who would have been in her 20s during that time period. While Elmer wasn't particularly skilled at estimating women's ages, Bernice looked far too young to have completed her education more than 25 years earlier. Her skin had the smooth texture and unlined quality that he associated with people in their 30s, not someone who should be approaching 50 if her timeline was accurate. More troubling were her references to business practices and technology that seemed inconsistent with the time frame she was describing. When discussing her early career experiences, she mentioned using computer software and communication systems that Elmer was fairly certain hadn't existed in the late 1990s. Her casual references to social media marketing and online collaboration tools suggested familiarity with business practices that had only become common in recent years, yet she spoke about them as if they'd been part of her professional toolkit since the beginning of her career. The inconsistencies extended to her knowledge of current events and cultural references. While discussing the challenges facing small businesses in the Hudson Valley, she mentioned recent developments in local politics and economic policy with the kind of detailed accuracy that could only come from someone who followed regional affairs closely. But when Elmer tried to engage her in conversation about major historical events that should have occurred during her supposed career timeline, her responses seemed vague and uncertain, as if she were guessing about things that should have been part of her lived experience. Elmer initially attributed these inconsistencies to his own misunderstanding or poor memory for details. Bernice was clearly an intelligent and successful professional, and he assumed that any confusion about dates or timelines was due to his own limited education rather than any problems with her account of her life and career. After all, he'd spent his adult life focused on the mechanical and logistical aspects of trucking, rather than keeping track of business trends or technological developments that might affect other industries. The conversation continued to be enjoyable and engaging, with Bernice displaying the kind of broad knowledge and quick wit that made her an entertaining companion for the long miles through the Hudson Valley. Her stories about difficult clients and challenging projects were told with humor and insight that demonstrated both professional competence and personal resilience. Elmer found himself genuinely interested in her work and impressed by her ability to navigate the complex world of corporate consulting. But as they continued north toward Albany, the small discrepancies in her stories began to accumulate into a pattern that was increasingly difficult to ignore. Her references to people, places, and events seemed to shift and change depending on the context of their conversation, as if she were drawing from multiple different timelines or perhaps fabricating details to match whatever topic they were discussing at the moment. The problem became more pronounced when Elmer started paying closer attention to the specific details of her business explanations. While her general knowledge of marketing and consulting was impressive, her descriptions of actual projects and client relationships seemed somehow artificial or rehearsed. The stories she told about overcoming challenges and achieving successes had the polished quality of presentation materials rather than the messy, complicated reality that characterized most professional experiences. When Elmer asked follow-up questions about specific aspects of her work, Bernice's responses often seemed to dodge the details rather than providing the kind of concrete information that someone with genuine experience should have been able to share easily. Her explanations of consulting methodologies and client management strategies were theoretically sound, but lacked the practical specifics that would indicate hands-on experience with the challenges she was describing. The growing sense that something was wrong with his passenger's account of herself made Elmer increasingly uncomfortable, though he couldn't identify exactly what was bothering him about their conversation. Bernice continued to be pleasant and engaging, showing genuine interest in his trucking experiences and asking intelligent questions about the logistics and challenges of long-haul freight transportation. Her behavior remained entirely normal and appropriate, giving him no rational reason for the unease that was gradually replacing his initial enjoyment of her company. The psychological discomfort Elmer was experiencing reflected his growing awareness that he might have made a serious error in judgment by picking up a hitchhiker whose story didn't hold up to careful scrutiny. The professional trucking community was filled with cautionary tales about drivers who'd been deceived by passengers who seemed legitimate until their true intentions were revealed. While Bernice showed no signs of being dangerous or criminally minded, the inconsistencies in her stories suggested that she wasn't being entirely honest about her identity or circumstances. Elmer's years of experience in the trucking industry had taught him to trust his instincts when something felt wrong, even if he couldn't articulate exactly what was triggering his concerns. The combination of small inconsistencies, timeline problems, and vague responses to specific questions created a pattern that his subconscious mind recognized as potentially deceptive, even though his rational mind couldn't identify any specific lies or contradictions that would justify his growing suspicion. The tension between his instinctive unease and his desire to be helpful and courteous to a passenger who seemed genuinely stranded created internal conflict that made the remainder of their journey increasingly stressful. Elmer found himself analyzing every word of their conversation, looking for additional signs that might confirm or dispel his concerns about Bernice's truthfulness. The enjoyable discussion that had initially made the miles pass quickly was transformed into a careful interrogation that made both of them increasingly uncomfortable. As they approached the outskirts of Albany, Bernice asked Elmer to drop her off at a specific address downtown rather than at a general location like the bus station or airport. She explained that her presentation was at a corporate office building, and she wanted to arrive with enough time to prepare for her meeting with potential clients who represented a significant business opportunity for her consulting firm. The request seemed reasonable and professional, consistent with her stated purpose for traveling to Albany. Elmer was happy to accommodate the request, understanding the importance of punctuality in the business world and appreciating the opportunity to help someone meet their professional obligations. The specific address provided by Bernice seemed legitimate, and her directions through the city's downtown district demonstrated the kind of local knowledge that supported her claims about working in the region. Her familiarity with Albany's street layout and traffic patterns suggested genuine experience with the city, rather than the uncertain navigation that might be expected from someone visiting for the first time. However, the address Bernice provided led them to an area of Albany that Elmer didn't recognize, despite having made deliveries in the city dozens of times over the years. The streets seemed older and more European in their layout than the parts of Albany he was familiar with narrow lanes and historic buildings that suggested they were in one of the city's oldest neighborhoods. The architecture was impressive and well-maintained, but the overall atmosphere felt somehow disconnected from the modern commercial district where Elmer would have expected to find the kind of corporate offices that typically hosted business presentations. The buildings they passed were primarily residential, with elaborate Victorian houses and converted mansions that had been transformed into apartments or professional offices. While some of these structures might indeed house consulting firms or other businesses, the neighborhood didn't have the commercial character that Elmer associated with the Albany business district. The absence of office buildings, corporate signage, and business traffic made him wonder if they were heading to the right location for Bernice's important meeting. "Just up ahead on the left," Bernice said, pointing to a large brick building that appeared to be a converted mansion. "That's where my meeting is scheduled." Elmer pulled his truck to the curb in front of the building, noting that it looked more like a private residence than a corporate office. The structure was impressive, with elaborate architectural details and well-maintained grounds that suggested wealth and importance, but there were no business signs or professional indicators visible from the street that would identify it as a commercial facility. The building's windows were covered with heavy curtains that prevented any view of the interior, and the main entrance was equipped with a substantial wooden door that looked more appropriate for a private home than a business establishment. When Elmer mentioned his observation about the building's residential appearance, Bernice explained that many high-end consulting firms operated out of converted historic buildings to project an image of stability and tradition that impressed corporate clients. Her explanation sounded plausible, and Elmer knew that some professional service firms did indeed choose prestigious historic locations over modern office buildings to create the right impression for their target market. "Thank you again for the ride," Bernice said as she prepared to exit the truck. "You've been incredibly kind, and I really appreciate you going out of your way to help a stranger. Not many people would have taken the risk of picking up someone they didn't know, especially in today's world where everyone's so suspicious of each other." Her gratitude seemed genuine and heartfelt, and Elmer felt a measure of satisfaction in having helped someone reach their destination safely. Despite his earlier concerns about inconsistencies in her stories, Bernice had proven to be pleasant company and a reasonable passenger who'd caused no problems during their journey together. The experience reinforced his belief that most people were fundamentally decent and deserving of assistance when they found themselves in difficult situations. As Bernice opened the passenger door and stepped down from the cab, Elmer felt a strange reluctance to let her go. She'd been such pleasant company that he found himself wishing they'd had more time to talk, and he realized that he'd enjoyed the conversation more than any he'd had in months. The intellectual stimulation of discussing business strategies and professional challenges had provided a welcome break from the solitary routine of his trucking career, and he regretted that their encounter was coming to an end. Elmer watched through his passenger window as Bernice walked toward the building, noting how she moved with the confident stride of someone who was familiar with her destination. Her professional demeanor and purposeful movement reinforced the impression that she was indeed heading to an important business meeting, rather than engaging in some kind of deceptive activity. The concerns about inconsistencies in her stories seemed less important in light of her obvious competence and genuine appreciation for his assistance. But as Bernice approached the front door of the imposing brick building, something extraordinary happened that challenged everything Elmer thought he understood about reality. Instead of knocking on the door, ringing a doorbell, or using a key to enter the building, Bernice simply walked straight through the solid wooden door as if it didn't exist, disappearing into the building without opening or closing anything. The door remained firmly shut throughout her passage, showing no indication that anyone had entered or exited through it. Elmer blinked hard and shook his head, certain that his eyes had played a trick on him after hours of concentrated driving and the stress of worrying about his passengers' inconsistent stories. He rubbed his eyes and looked again, but Bernice was nowhere to be seen, and the door of the building remained firmly closed with no evidence that anyone had recently passed through it. The physical laws that governed the interaction between solid objects had apparently been suspended to allow his passenger to enter the building in a way that defied rational explanation. The impossibility of what he'd witnessed created a psychological shock that left Elmer sitting motionless in his truck cab, trying to process an experience that contradicted everything he understood about the physical world. People couldn't walk through solid doors, regardless of how confident they appeared or how important their business meetings might be. The phenomenon he'd observed was clearly impossible, yet he'd seen it happen with his own eyes under conditions that precluded hallucination or misperception. Elmer sat in his truck for several minutes, trying to develop rational explanations for what he'd witnessed. He considered the possibility that there had been a second entrance to the building that he hadn't noticed, or that Bernice had somehow opened and closed the door so quickly that he'd missed the movement. Perhaps the door had been partially open despite appearing closed, or maybe there was some kind of optical illusion created by the lighting conditions and the architectural details of the building's facade. But no matter how he tried to rationalize what he'd seen, he couldn't escape the disturbing conclusion that his passenger had somehow passed through a solid barrier, as if it were made of air. The door had been substantial and clearly closed, with no visible mechanism that could have allowed passage without opening. The physical evidence contradicted his observation, yet he trusted his senses enough to know that something genuinely impossible had occurred right in front of him. Troubled by the experience and uncertain about what he should do, Elmer decided to investigate the building more closely to see if he could find some explanation for Bernice's mysterious entrance. He locked his truck and walked up the front path to the imposing wooden door, examining it carefully for any signs of how someone might have entered without opening it. The door was solid and substantial, crafted from heavy oak with iron hardware that looked like it had been installed when the building was originally constructed decades earlier. The wood showed the normal wear and weathering that came from years of exposure to Albany's seasonal weather changes, but there was no visible damage or unusual features that might explain what he'd witnessed. When Elmer knocked on the door, the sound was deep and resonant, confirming that it was indeed made of solid wood rather than some kind of illusion or trick construction. The heavy thudding echoed through what sounded like a large interior space, but no one responded to his repeated attempts to attract attention. He tried the door handle and found it locked, with the kind of substantial deadbolt mechanism that would prevent unauthorized entry by anyone who lacked the proper keys. After several minutes of increasingly forceful knocking, the door was finally opened by an elderly man wearing a dark suit who looked like he might be a butler or house manager. The man's expression was polite but puzzled, as if he wasn't accustomed to unexpected visitors and wasn't quite sure how to handle the situation. His clothing was formal and old-fashioned, with the kind of careful attention to detail that suggested he took pride in maintaining proper appearances despite his advanced age. "I'm looking for a woman named Bernice Coleman," Elmer explained, trying to keep his voice steady despite the growing anxiety he felt about the situation. "I just dropped her off here for a business meeting. She said she was a marketing consultant and that she had an important presentation scheduled this afternoon. The elderly man's puzzled expression deepened, and he shook his head slowly with the kind of deliberate movement that suggested he was carefully considering Elmer's request before responding. "I'm sorry, sir, but there's no one by that name here, and we're not expecting any business meetings today. This is a private residence, not a commercial office building." The response hit Elmer like a physical blow, confirming his worst fears about the supernatural nature of his passenger, while raising even more disturbing questions about what had actually happened during their journey together. He described Bernice in detail, from her navy blue dress to her professional demeanor and her claimed expertise in marketing consulting. But the man insisted that no one matching that description had entered the building during the past several hours. "Perhaps you're thinking of a different address?" the elderly man suggested, with the kind of patient courtesy that indicated genuine desire to be helpful. "There are several office buildings in the downtown area where business meetings are commonly held. I'd be happy to provide directions if you can give me more specific information about the company or organization your passenger was planning to visit." But Elmer knew with absolute certainty that this was the address Bernice had provided, and the building where he'd watched her disappear through a solid wooden door. The impossibility of the situation was becoming undeniable, forcing him to confront the reality that his passenger had somehow violated the basic physical laws that governed the interaction between solid objects and human bodies. The elderly man invited Elmer to speak with other residents of the house, hoping that someone else might have information about a business meeting or might have seen someone matching Bernice's description entering the building. But the conversations that followed only deepened the mystery and confirmed that Bernice's entry into the building had occurred in a way that defied rational explanation. The other residents were courteous and helpful, but none of them had seen anyone resembling the woman Elmer described. According to everyone he spoke with, no one had entered the building during the past several hours, and certainly no one had walked through the front door during the time period when Elmer claimed to have witnessed Bernice's mysterious entrance. The building's inhabitants seemed genuinely puzzled by his account of events, and clearly had no knowledge of any business activities that might explain a consultant's visit to their residential facility. As Elmer returned to his truck, his mind reeling from the impossibility of the situation and the growing realization that he'd experienced something that challenged his understanding of reality itself, he began to notice other details about his experience with Bernice that suddenly seemed significant and deeply disturbing. The inconsistencies in her stories that had initially seemed like minor discrepancies now appeared to be evidence of something far more serious than simple confusion about dates or timelines. He realized that throughout their 2-hour conversation, he'd never seen Bernice's reflection in any of the truck's mirrors, despite the fact that she'd been sitting directly in the passenger seat where her image should have been clearly visible in both the driver's side mirror and the rear view mirror. Her voice had seemed to come from the right direction, but when he'd looked directly at her while driving, he'd always had to focus intently to see her clearly, as if she was somehow difficult for his eyes to process or register accurately. The phenomenon was so unusual that Elmer couldn't understand how he'd failed to notice it during their journey together. Professional truck drivers develop the habit of checking their mirrors constantly, monitoring traffic conditions and the behavior of their passengers as part of their standard safety procedures. The absence of Bernice's reflection should have been immediately obvious, yet somehow he'd failed to register this fundamental violation of optical physics until after she'd disappeared through the solid door. Most disturbing of all, when Elmer checked his truck's electronic systems, he discovered that there was no record of a passenger having been in the cab during his journey from Newburgh to Albany. The seat sensors that monitored weight and occupancy for safety and insurance purposes showed no indication that anyone had sat in the passenger seat during the time period when Bernice had supposedly been riding with him. The air pressure readings, temperature controls, and even the simple door opening sensors registered no activity that would indicate a passenger had entered or exited the vehicle. According to every electronic system in his truck, Elmer had been driving alone from Queens to Albany, despite his clear memories of a lengthy and engaging conversation with a woman who had seemed completely real and physically present throughout their journey together. The technology that monitored every aspect of his truck's operation had somehow failed to detect the presence of someone who had carried on detailed conversations about business strategies and professional experiences for more than 2 hours. The remainder of Elmer's drive to Buffalo passed in a fog of confusion and uncertainty that made it difficult for him to concentrate on the routine tasks of professional trucking. He replayed every moment of his interaction with Bernice, trying to find some rational explanation for what had happened. But the more he analyzed the experience, the more convinced he became that he'd encountered something beyond normal human understanding. The woman had seemed completely real during their conversation, displaying knowledge, personality, and emotional responses that were far too complex and consistent to be explained as hallucination or psychological projection. Yet the evidence suggested that she'd been something else entirely, something that could appear solid and tangible, but wasn't bound by the same physical laws that governed the rest of the world. When Elmer completed his delivery in Buffalo and checked into a motel for his mandatory rest period, he was exhausted not just from the driving, but from the psychological strain of trying to process an experience that challenged everything he thought he understood about reality. He'd spent 15 years as a professional truck driver, covering hundreds of thousands of miles on America's highways without ever experiencing anything that contradicted his rational worldview. The quiet of his motel room provided the first opportunity Elmer had to research what had happened to him without the distractions of traffic and highway navigation. Using the motel's Wi-Fi connection, he began searching for information about the Albany address where he'd dropped off Bernice, hoping to find some explanation for the strange events he'd witnessed. What he discovered made his blood run cold and forced him to confront the possibility that his passenger hadn't been alive at all. The internet search results about the Albany address revealed a history that sent chills down his spine and confirmed his worst fears about the supernatural nature of his encounter. According to the Albany County Historical Society's website, the imposing Victorian mansion where Elmer had watched Bernice disappear had been the site of a tragic accident in 1987, when a marketing executive named Bernice M. Coleman had died in a car crash while rushing to an important business presentation during a severe thunderstorm. The newspaper archives from that period painted a detailed picture of the accident that had claimed Bernice's life 37 years earlier. She had been driving from a client meeting in the Hudson Valley to Albany when her rental car had skidded off the road during a heavy rainstorm, rolling several times before coming to rest against a tree that had been split in half by a lightning strike. Emergency responders had found her dressed in a navy blue business suit, clutching a leather purse that contained her presentation materials and identification cards. The meeting she'd been rushing to attend was scheduled to take place at the historic mansion that now served as the headquarters for a prestigious consulting firm, the same building where Elmer had watched her walk through a solid wooden door as if it were made of air. The coincidence was too perfect and too specific to be explained by chance or misunderstanding. The woman who'd ridden in his truck from Newburgh to Albany was somehow connected to a fatal accident that had occurred more than 3 decades earlier. According to the accident report, Bernice had been 34 years old at the time of her death, with dark hair and the kind of professional demeanor that matched Elmer's memory of his passenger perfectly. The photographs accompanying the newspaper articles showed a woman who could have been the identical twin of the person who'd shared his cab for 2 hours of highway driving. The only difference was that the real Bernice Coleman had died more than a decade before Elmer had even started his trucking career. The historical records revealed even more disturbing details about Bernice's death and its aftermath that explained some of the mysterious aspects of Elmer's encounter with her apparent spirit. Several witnesses at the scene of the accident had reported seeing her walking away from the wreckage, apparently uninjured and still carrying her leather purse. But when emergency responders had arrived minutes later, they found only her body inside the mangled vehicle. Search teams had combed the surrounding forest for hours, looking for any sign of a survivor who might have wandered away from the crash site in a state of shock or confusion. They found no footprints, no torn clothing, and no indication that anyone had left the area on foot. The mystery had deepened when investigators discovered that Bernice's presentation materials were missing from the crash site, despite multiple witnesses who had seen her carrying them when she left her client meeting earlier that afternoon. Her purse had been found inside the car, but it was empty except for her identification and credit cards. The business documents she'd been preparing for her Albany meeting had vanished completely, as if they'd been removed from the scene by someone who understood their importance and wanted to help her complete her professional obligations despite her death. The newspaper accounts from 1987 included quotes from other drivers who had stopped to help at the accident scene, describing their confusion about seeing someone walking away from wreckage that should have been unsurvivable. One witness, a truck driver named Harold Morrison, had reported following what appeared to be an uninjured woman for several hundred yards before losing sight of her in the darkness and rain. When he'd returned to guide emergency responders to her location, he'd found no trace of anyone who matched his description of the survivor he'd been trying to help. Over the years since the accident, there had been numerous reports of a woman matching Bernice's description appearing along Interstate 87 between Newburgh and Albany, always dressed in the same navy blue business suit and carrying the same leather purse. Motorists who'd stopped to offer assistance described her as polite and articulate, with detailed knowledge of the Hudson Valley region and specific expertise in marketing and business consulting. Without exception, every person who'd given her a ride to Albany had watched her disappear when she reached her destination, walking through solid barriers or simply vanishing into thin air when she encountered the building where her fatal business meeting had been scheduled to take place. The consistency of these reports over nearly 4 decades suggested that Bernice's spirit was trapped in an endless loop of trying to complete the professional obligation that had cost her life. The reports were so frequent and consistent that the phenomenon had earned recognition among paranormal researchers who studied highway hauntings and roadside apparitions. They called her the Deadline Ghost, a spirit who was apparently doomed to repeat her final journey for eternity, forever trying to reach the business meeting that had been interrupted by her tragic death during the thunderstorm of 1987. What made Bernice's case particularly unusual among highway ghost stories was the interactive nature of her appearances and the detailed conversations she carried on with the drivers who picked her up. Most phantom hitchhikers were described as silent or monosyllabic, communicating only through gestures and basic responses to direct questions. But Bernice engaged her drivers in lengthy, detailed conversations, displaying knowledge and personality that seemed far too complex for a simple residual haunting or echo of past events. According to the paranormal researchers who'd investigated the case, Bernice's spirit seemed to be trapped in a loop that began with her final client meeting in the Hudson Valley and ended with her attempt to reach the presentation that had been scheduled for the afternoon of her death. Every few weeks, she would appear beside Interstate 87, seeking a ride to Albany so she could fulfill the professional obligations that had been interrupted by her fatal accident. The drivers, who became unwitting participants in her eternal attempt to complete her final business transaction, were helping her cross the boundary between the world of the living and whatever realm claimed her when she reached her destination. Each ride represented another opportunity for Bernice to fulfill the professional responsibility that had been interrupted by her death, though the fulfillment could never be complete because the world had moved beyond the circumstances that had existed in 1987. The research Elmer conducted over the following hours revealed that his experience was part of a pattern that had been repeated countless times over the past 37 years, with variations that reflected changes in the trucking industry and the evolution of Interstate 87's traffic patterns. Other truckers had encountered Bernice during different decades, describing conversations that were virtually identical to the one Elmer remembered, but adapted to reflect the professional concerns and technological realities of their respective time periods. During the 1990s, drivers reported discussions about fax machines and early computer systems that were just beginning to transform business communication. In the early 2000s, her conversations focused on email marketing and website development as revolutionary tools for reaching corporate clients. More recent encounters included detailed discussions about social media strategies and mobile technology applications that demonstrated her spirit's ability to adapt to changing business practices while maintaining her core identity as a marketing consultant from the 1980s. The most disturbing aspect of the phenomenon, according to the paranormal research Elmer discovered, was its effect on the drivers who encountered Bernice and became aware of her supernatural nature. Most of them experienced lasting psychological changes following their interaction with the ghostly passenger, developing obsessions with understanding what they'd witnessed and compulsive behaviors related to highway travel and supernatural phenomena. Many drivers reported sleep disturbances, recurring dreams about car crashes, and an overwhelming sense of responsibility for helping other travelers in distress. The encounter with Bernice seemed to awaken a heightened sensitivity to the spiritual dimensions of highway travel, making these drivers aware of other supernatural phenomena they'd previously ignored or rationalized away. Some became convinced that the highways were populated by numerous spirits of people who died trying to reach their destinations, leading to anxiety and paranoia that interfered with their professional duties. The psychological impact was so severe that some drivers had changed their routes entirely to avoid the stretch of Interstate 87 where Bernice appeared, taking longer and less efficient paths to their destinations rather than risk another encounter with the supernatural. Others had quit trucking altogether, unable to cope with the knowledge that the highways they'd traveled safely for years were populated by spirits of people who died in pursuit of goals they could never complete. The phenomenon had claimed the careers and peace of mind of dozens of professional drivers over the decades, turning experienced veterans of the road into nervous, haunted men and women who jumped at shadows and questioned every passenger they saw beside the highway. The curse of encountering Bernice seemed to spread beyond the initial interaction, affecting drivers' relationships with their families, their ability to maintain steady employment, and their fundamental understanding of reality itself. Elmer spent the rest of his mandatory rest period reading testimonials from other drivers who'd encountered Bernice, finding their accounts so similar to his own experience that he began to suspect he was reading descriptions of his own afternoon rather than separate incidents that had occurred over multiple decades. The conversations they described were nearly identical, with Bernice asking the same questions about trucking life and sharing the same stories about her consulting career and her educational background. Even the specific details of her appearance were consistent across decades of sightings, from the navy blue dress to the leather purse to the professional hairstyle that never seemed to change despite the passage of time and the evolution of fashion trends. The photographs that some drivers had attempted to take showed only empty passenger seats, despite their clear memories of detailed conversations with a woman whose presence had seemed completely real and substantial throughout their journeys. The testimonials also revealed another disturbing pattern in Bernice's behavior that Elmer hadn't noticed during his own encounter, but now recognized as significant. According to several drivers, she seemed to know things about their personal lives that she couldn't possibly have learned during their brief conversations. She'd mentioned wives' names, children's ages, and financial struggles that the drivers had never discussed with anyone, displaying knowledge that suggested some kind of supernatural insight into their private affairs. The phenomenon was so unsettling that some drivers had become convinced that Bernice could read their thoughts or access their memories, using her ghostly abilities to gather information about the living people who encountered her. The invasion of privacy created an additional layer of psychological trauma that made the encounter even more disturbing and long-lasting in its effects on the victim's mental health and sense of security. One trucker named Wilbur Clemens had documented his encounter with Bernice in extraordinary detail, providing a minute-by-minute account of their conversation and her eventual disappearance at the Albany address. According to Wilbur's report, Bernice had demonstrated knowledge of trucking regulations and industry practices that seemed far too current for someone who'd died in 1987, suggesting that her spirit somehow stayed informed about developments in the modern world despite her physical absence from it. Wilbur had also noted that Bernice's reflection was never visible in the truck's mirrors, despite her apparent solidity and normal behavior during their conversation. He'd tested this phenomenon deliberately, adjusting his mirrors and looking for her image while she was speaking. But he'd never been able to see her reflection regardless of the angle or lighting conditions. The absence of a reflection had been so consistent that Wilbur had become convinced it was a reliable method for identifying supernatural passengers, a test that could help drivers distinguish between living hitchhikers and ghostly apparitions. The research Elmer conducted revealed that Interstate 87 was considered one of the most haunted highways in New York State, with dozens of documented ghost sightings and paranormal encounters reported by travelers over the past several decades. The route passed through areas with significant historical importance, including battlefields from the Revolutionary War and sites of industrial accidents that had claimed numerous lives during the 19th and 20th centuries. According to paranormal investigators, the combination of violent death and unfinished business created ideal conditions for ghostly manifestations, making the highway a corridor between the world of the living and the realm of the dead. The interstate system's role as a major transportation artery meant that thousands of people traveled through these spiritually active areas every day, creating numerous opportunities for encounters between living travelers and supernatural entities seeking to complete interrupted journeys. Bernice's case was particularly well documented because of her frequent appearances and the consistent nature of her interactions with living drivers. Unlike many highway ghosts who appeared only briefly before vanishing, Bernice engaged in lengthy conversations that provided researchers with substantial material for analysis and comparison. Her ability to maintain complex discussions about business topics and current events suggested a level of consciousness and awareness that was unusual among paranormal entities, making her one of the most studied spirits in the northeastern United States. The paranormal research also revealed that Bernice's appearances were linked to specific weather conditions and calendar dates that corresponded to the circumstances of her original death. She was most likely to manifest during autumn months, particularly on days when business travelers would be rushing to meet deadlines or attend important meetings. The timing seemed to correlate with the pressures and anxieties that had driven her to travel during dangerous weather conditions on the night of her fatal accident. The anniversary of her death, October 15th, was marked by particularly intense supernatural activity along Interstate 87, with multiple sightings reported by drivers who encountered various manifestations of her spirit during the 24-hour period surrounding the date of her original accident. Some witnesses described seeing her standing beside the highway at the exact location where her car had left the road, while others reported picking her up at different points along the route and experiencing the same disappearance when they reached the Albany address. As Elmer prepared to resume his journey back to New York, he found himself fundamentally changed by his research into Bernice's story and his own encounter with her spirit. The woman who'd seemed so alive and engaging during their afternoon conversation had been dead for longer than he'd been a professional truck driver, yet she'd demonstrated knowledge and personality that seemed impossible for a ghostly manifestation to maintain over multiple decades of supernatural existence. The experience had challenged everything he thought he understood about the nature of death and the boundaries between the physical and spiritual worlds, forcing him to confront possibilities that his rational mind had always dismissed as superstition or fantasy. The highways that had once provided him with peaceful solitude and meditative driving experiences were now revealed to be populated by entities that existed at the intersection of memory and reality, past and present, life and death, The drive back to Queens passed in a state of heightened awareness that made every shadow seem potentially significant and every hitchhiker beside the highway appear as a possible supernatural encounter. Elmer found himself checking his mirrors constantly, not for traffic conditions, but for reflections that might not be there, and listening to conversations that might be coming from passengers who didn't exist in any conventional sense of the word. The knowledge that Interstate 87 was populated by the spirits of people who died trying to reach their destinations had transformed his familiar route into a corridor of mystery and potential danger, where the normal rules of human interaction no longer applied, and the boundaries between reality and the supernatural became increasingly blurred. When Elmer finally reached his apartment in Queens, he was exhausted not just from the driving, but from the psychological strain of processing his encounter with Bernice and its implications for his understanding of reality. He'd spent 15 years as a professional truck driver, covering hundreds of thousands of miles on America's highways without ever experiencing anything that challenged his rational worldview. Now, in the space of a single afternoon, he'd been forced to confront the possibility that the roads he traveled were populated by entities that existed outside the normal boundaries of life and death. The small apartment that had served as his sanctuary between trips now felt inadequate as a refuge from the supernatural forces he'd discovered operating along the highways. The familiar routines of unpacking his gear, checking his mail, and preparing for his next assignment seemed trivial and meaningless compared to the profound questions raised by his encounter with a woman who'd been dead for 37 years, yet had seemed more alive and engaging than most living people he'd known. Sleep came fitfully that night, interrupted by dreams that blended his memories of conversations with Bernice with images from the newspaper accounts of her fatal accident. He found himself reliving their journey together, but with the horrifying awareness that his passenger was a spirit trapped in an endless loop of seeking completion for interrupted business. The nightmare versions of their conversation revealed details he'd missed during the actual encounter, supernatural signs that should have warned him about her true nature. In his dreams, Elmer noticed that Bernice never actually touched anything in his truck cab, that her voice had a slight echo that suggested she was speaking from somewhere beyond the physical world, and that her knowledge of current events was filtered through the perspective of someone who died decades earlier. The dream conversations revealed the tragic desperation behind her professional demeanor, as she spoke about meeting deadlines and impressing clients who had long since forgotten her existence. The following days brought a fundamental change in Elmer's approach to his trucking career and his relationship with the highways he'd traveled for 15 years. Every stretch of road became potentially significant as a location where supernatural encounters might occur, and every hitchhiker beside the highway represented a possible spirit seeking assistance with unfinished business. The peaceful solitude he'd once found in long-distance driving was replaced by constant vigilance for signs of otherworldly activity. Elmer began researching other documented cases of highway hauntings, discovering that his encounter with Bernice was part of a much larger phenomenon that affected truckers throughout the United States. Professional drivers, because of their extensive travel schedules and their presence on the roads during the quiet hours when paranormal activity was most likely to occur, were particularly susceptible to encountering spirits who sought assistance with interrupted journeys. The trucking community, he learned, had an informal network for sharing information about supernatural encounters and haunted stretches of highway. Experienced drivers used coded language on CB radio channels, referring to unusual passengers and special cargo when discussing their experiences with entities that existed beyond normal human understanding. Certain routes were known within the community as particularly active areas where spirits frequently manifested, and veteran truckers would warn newcomers about specific locations where they might encounter something that challenged their understanding of reality. The knowledge that supernatural encounters were more common than he'd ever imagined provided Elmer with a sense of community among drivers who'd experienced similar phenomena. but it also increased his awareness of the psychological toll that such experiences could take on professional truckers. Many drivers who'd encountered highway spirits developed lasting anxieties about their work, becoming hypervigilant about passenger behavior and road conditions in ways that interfered with their ability to perform their duties effectively. Some truckers became obsessed with documenting and understanding paranormal activity along their regular routes, spending their off-duty hours researching historical accidents and supernatural sightings, rather than resting and maintaining their physical and mental health. The fascination with otherworldly phenomena could become as destructive as the initial encounter itself, leading to isolation from family and friends who couldn't understand or share their supernatural experiences. Elmer recognized these warning signs in his own behavior as he found himself drawn deeper into the study of highway hauntings and the documentation of supernatural encounters. His apartment became cluttered with printouts of accident reports, newspaper clippings about unexplained phenomena, and maps marking locations where spirits had been sighted by other drivers. The research provided intellectual stimulation and a sense of purpose, but it also represented a form of avoidance of the normal social interactions that had become difficult since his encounter with Bernice. The isolation that resulted from his growing preoccupation with supernatural phenomena created a feedback loop that made otherworldly encounters seem more significant and meaningful than relationships with living people. The spirits who populated the highways offered mysteries to be solved and stories to be understood, while living humans presented complications and demands that required emotional investment and vulnerability that Elmer was increasingly reluctant to provide. The turning point in Elmer's relationship with the supernatural came during a routine freight run from New York to Boston several weeks after his encounter with Bernice, when he decided to test his growing understanding of highway spirits by deliberately seeking out another paranormal encounter. His research had identified several locations along his route where other drivers had reported supernatural sightings, and he found himself hoping to encounter another ghostly passenger who might provide additional insights into the spiritual dimensions of highway travel. The experiment proved successful in ways that Elmer hadn't anticipated, but the encounter that resulted challenged his romantic notions about helping lost souls and forced him to confront the darker aspects of supernatural highway activity. Not all spirits were benevolent entities seeking assistance with interrupted journeys. Some were malevolent forces that used the highways to prey upon living travelers in ways that were far more dangerous than simple requests for transportation to specific destinations. The malevolent spirit that Elmer encountered during his deliberate search for paranormal activity taught him that his growing involvement with supernatural phenomena carried risks that extended far beyond psychological stress or social isolation. Some highway spirits were actively hostile to the living, seeking to cause accidents, create confusion, or lure drivers into dangerous situations that could result in injury or death. The knowledge that he'd been seeking out encounters with entities that might wish him harm forced Elmer to reconsider his approach to supernatural highway activity. The experience with the hostile spirit also revealed that his encounter with Bernice had changed him in ways that made him more sensitive to paranormal phenomena, but also more vulnerable to supernatural manipulation. The boundary between the physical and spiritual worlds had become more permeable for him, allowing him to perceive otherworldly activity that most people couldn't detect, but also exposing him to influences that could affect his judgment and behavior in potentially dangerous ways. Elmer realized that his fascination with highway spirits was becoming an obsession that threatened his safety and his sanity, leading him to seek out experiences that could result in serious harm. The romantic notion of helping lost souls complete their interrupted journeys was revealed to be dangerously naive when applied to supernatural entities whose motivations and capabilities extended far beyond simple requests for transportation assistance. The process of extricating himself from his growing involvement with paranormal phenomena required conscious effort and deliberate changes to his trucking routine that would reduce his exposure to supernatural activity while allowing him to continue his career as a professional driver. Elmer began avoiding the routes and locations where spirits were most commonly sighted, choosing longer but safer paths that minimized his chances of encountering otherworldly passengers. He also developed strategies for protecting himself from supernatural influence during unavoidable encounters with highway spirits, including mental exercises that helped maintain his connection to physical reality and techniques for distinguishing between helpful and harmful supernatural entities. The protective measures were based on research into paranormal activity and the experiences of other drivers who'd learned to coexist with highway spirits without becoming consumed by fascination with otherworldly phenomena. The balance that Elmer eventually achieved between awareness of supernatural highway activity and practical concern for his own safety and well-being allowed him to continue his trucking career while maintaining respect for the spirits who populated the roads he traveled. His encounter with Bernice had opened his eyes to dimensions of reality that most people never experienced, but it had also taught him that knowledge of the supernatural carried responsibilities and dangers that required careful management. As Elmer's story concludes, he remains a professional truck driver who travels the highways of the northeastern United States with a deeper understanding of the spiritual forces that operate alongside the normal world of commerce and transportation. His encounter with the vanishing passenger changed his relationship with his profession and his understanding of the boundaries between life and death. But it also taught him that some mysteries are better observed from a safe distance rather than investigated too closely. The highways continue to carry their cargo of both freight and spirits, living drivers and ghostly passengers, routine transportation and supernatural encounters. For those with the sensitivity to perceive otherworldly activity, the roads offer glimpses into dimensions of existence that transcend the normal boundaries of human experience. But they also demand respect for forces that operate according to rules that living people can never fully understand or control, and wisdom to know when curiosity about the supernatural should give way to practical concerns about survival in the physical world. The headlights cut through the darkness as Chester Millfield guides his 2018 Freightliner Cascadia down Interstate 80 through the desolate stretches of Nebraska, where the nearest town could be 50 miles in any direction, and the horizon disappears into an endless void of prairie grass and scattered farmsteads. Chester's engine temperature gauge has been climbing steadily for the past 20 miles, despite the cool October air that should be helping his cooling system operate efficiently, and the subtle vibration in his steering wheel suggests that his truck is developing mechanical problems that could leave him stranded in one of America's most isolated regions. Chester is hauling 42,000 pounds of agricultural equipment from Iowa to Colorado, running slightly behind schedule due to earlier delays at the shipper's facility, but still within his delivery window if he can maintain his current pace through the night. The load represents a significant payday for Chester, who operates as an independent contractor and depends on timely deliveries to maintain his reputation among freight brokers who control access to the most lucrative shipping contracts. A breakdown in rural Nebraska would not only cost him money in repair expenses and delivery penalties, but could also damage his standing in the competitive world of specialized freight transportation. The first indication of serious trouble comes when Chester's engine temperature alarm begins chiming insistently, accompanied by warning lights that illuminate his dashboard with urgent red indicators. Steam is beginning to rise from beneath his hood, visible in the glow of his headlights, and the familiar rumble of his diesel engine has developed an irregular rhythm that suggests imminent mechanical failure. Chester reduces his speed and begins scanning the horizon for any signs of civilization where he might find assistance, or at least a safe place to park while he assesses the extent of his truck's problems. The relief Chester feels when he spots the glow of lights ahead is immediately tempered by confusion about their source. According to his GPS navigation system, he is traveling through a section of Nebraska where no commercial facilities are marked on any map. Yet the distinctive pattern of illumination suggests a truck stop or travel center with fuel islands and parking areas designed to accommodate commercial vehicles. As Chester approaches the facility, he notices that it appears to be a substantial operation with multiple fuel bays, a large convenience store, and a parking area that could hold dozens of trucks and trailers. The truck stop looks remarkably well maintained for such a remote location, with modern LED lighting that casts a bright white glow across freshly paved surfaces. The building architecture suggests recent construction, with clean lines and contemporary design elements that contrast sharply with the rural Nebraska landscape. Chester notes several other commercial vehicles parked in the lot, their running lights and reflective tape visible in the facility's illumination, indicating that other drivers have discovered this convenient stopping point despite its absence from standard highway resources guides. Chester pulls his overheating truck up to one of the fuel islands and shuts down his engine, immediately popping his hood to release the steam that has been building in his cooling system. The problem appears to be a burst radiator hose, a relatively minor repair that he can handle himself if he can find the necessary parts and coolant. The truck stop's convenience store should have basic automotive supplies, and the presence of other commercial vehicles suggests that this facility caters to professional drivers who might need emergency repairs or maintenance supplies. As Chester walks toward the convenience store, he notices details about the facility that seem inconsistent with its apparent newness and modern design. The pavement, while appearing freshly laid, shows wear patterns and oil stains that suggest years of heavy truck traffic. The building's exterior walls display fading and weathering that contradicts the bright, clean appearance visible from a distance. Most puzzling of all, the other trucks in the parking area show signs of extended use and poor maintenance that seem inconsistent with active commercial operations. The convenience store interior reinforces Chester's growing sense that something is wrong with this facility. While the building appears modern and well-equipped from outside, the interior fixtures and merchandise seem dated and dusty, as if they've been sitting unused for months or years. The fluorescent lighting flickers intermittently, creating shadows and dark spots that make it difficult to navigate the aisles effectively. The coolers along this back wall hum with an irregular rhythm that suggests failing compressors, and several of the refrigerated units display out-of-order signs that appear to have been posted long ago. Behind the counter stands a clerk who appears to be in his 50s, wearing a name tag that reads Homer, and a uniform shirt that shows signs of long wear and inadequate cleaning. Homer greets Chester with the kind of professional friendliness that suggests experience in customer service, but his eyes seem tired and distant, as if he's been working the same shift for longer than any reasonable employment schedule would require. When Chester asks about radiator hoses and coolant, Homer responds with helpful directions to the automotive section, but his voice carries an odd echo that seems inconsistent with the store's acoustics. The automotive section contains a surprisingly complete selection of truck maintenance supplies, including the specific type of radiator hose that Chester needs for his repair. The prices are reasonable, almost suspiciously low for such a remote location where transportation costs should inflate the cost of merchandise significantly. When Chester questions Homer about the favorable pricing, the clerk explains that the facility benefits from volume purchasing arrangements with suppliers, but his explanation seems rehearsed and unconvincing, as if he's repeated the same response to many previous customers. While gathering his repair supplies, Chester encounters another truck driver who introduces himself as Melvin Hartley, a veteran hauler who's been working the Midwest freight corridors for more than 20 years. Melvin is examining a display of CB radio equipment with the focused attention of someone who's experienced communication problems. And when Chester strikes up a conversation, Melvin's responses reveal a level of confusion and disorientation that seems inconsistent with his apparent experience and professionalism. "I've been looking for a replacement antenna for about 3 hours," Melvin says, his voice carrying a note of frustration that suggests his search has been less successful than expected. Every time I think I've found the right part, it turns out to be something different when I get to the counter. The merchandise keeps changing somehow, like the store is rearranging itself when I'm not looking. Chester examines the CB radio display and confirms that it contains a wide selection of antennas and communication equipment, but when he tries to help Melvin locate a specific part number, they discover that the inventory seems to shift and change depending on the angle from which they view it. Items that appear clearly labeled and accessible from one direction become blurred or obscured when approached from another angle, as if the merchandise exists in a state of constant flux that prevents customers from obtaining what they need. The conversation with Melvin reveals additional disturbing information about the truck stop and its effects on the drivers who stop there. According to Melvin, he arrived at the facility several hours earlier with mechanical problems similar to Chester's, expecting to make quick repairs and continue his journey to Denver. But every attempt to leave the facility has resulted in mechanical failures that force him to return to the parking area, creating a cycle of breakdown and temporary repair that prevents him from reaching his destination. Every time I think I've fixed my truck and I'm ready to get back on the road, something else goes wrong, Melvin explains. First it was my alternator, then my brakes started acting up, and now my transmission is making noises I've never heard before. It's like the truck doesn't want me to leave this place, or maybe the place doesn't want to let me go. Other drivers in the facility, Melvin reports, are experiencing similar problems with mechanical failures that prevent departure. Some have been stranded at the truck stop for days or even weeks, living on the food and supplies available in the convenience store while their trucks develop increasingly serious problems that require more extensive repairs. The facility seems to provide just enough resources to keep the drivers alive and occupied, but never enough to allow them to complete their repairs and resume their journeys. The conversation with Melvin takes on an increasingly urgent tone as he describes the psychological effects of extended confinement at the truck stop. Drivers who have been stranded for longer periods show signs of mental deterioration, becoming withdrawn and apathetic about their situation. They seem to accept their confinement as a permanent condition rather than a temporary inconvenience, and they discourage newer arrivals from attempting to leave the facility. The long-term residents have formed a kind of community within the truck stop, sharing resources and information but never discussing plans for escape or return to their normal lives. As Chester listens to Melvin's increasingly frantic account of life at the Eternal Rest Stop, he begins to notice subtle changes in his own environment that suggest the facility operates according to rules that differ from normal reality. The convenience store's merchandise continues to shift and change when he's not looking directly at it, and the other customers in the store move with a mechanical precision that suggests they're following predetermined patterns rather than making spontaneous decisions about their purchases. Most disturbing of all, when Chester looks out the store windows toward the parking area where he left his truck, he discovers that his Freightliner has developed additional problems during the brief time he's been inside the building. Steam is rising from multiple locations around his engine, and fluid stains on the pavement suggest that his mechanical problems have multiplied and intensified in ways that seem inconsistent with normal equipment failure patterns. The realization that his truck's condition is deteriorating faster than mechanical laws would allow fills Chester with a growing sense of panic about his situation. If the truck stop truly is a trap designed to prevent drivers from leaving, then his arrival has triggered processes that will make escape increasingly difficult with each passing hour. The facility seems designed to create mechanical problems that require parts and services available only within the truck stop, creating a cycle of dependency that keeps drivers confined indefinitely. Homer's behavior behind the convenience store counter reinforces Chester's growing suspicions about the supernatural nature of the facility. The clerk continues to provide helpful customer service, but his responses to questions about the truck stop's history and management are evasive and contradictory. When Chester asks how long the facility has been operating in this location, Homer provides different answers depending on how the question is phrased, sometimes claiming the truck stop has been there for decades, and other times suggesting it's a recent addition to the highway infrastructure. The inconsistencies in Homer's responses extend to basic information about services and amenities available at the facility. He describes repair facilities and mechanical services that aren't visible anywhere on the property, and he mentions restaurants and lodging accommodations that don't appear to exist. When Chester asks to see these additional facilities, Homer provides directions that lead to empty areas of the parking lot or to sections of the building that are locked and inaccessible. As midnight approaches and Chester realizes that his repair efforts are becoming increasingly futile, he begins to understand that the truck stop represents a form of purgatory designed specifically for professional drivers. The facility provides the illusion of assistance and accommodation while actually trapping its victims in an endless cycle of mechanical problems and failed repair attempts. The drivers who remain at the truck stop for extended periods aren't choosing to stay. They're being held prisoner by forces that understand their professional needs and exploit their dependence on functional equipment. Chester's growing understanding of his predicament becomes more acute as he spends additional time observing the other stranded drivers and the patterns of behavior that have developed within the supernatural truck stop. The facility operates with the efficiency of a well-designed trap, providing just enough comfort and resources to prevent panic while systematically undermining every attempt at escape. The drivers who have been confined for longer periods have adapted to their situation in ways that suggest psychological conditioning, accepting their imprisonment as a permanent state rather than a temporary inconvenience that can be resolved through determination and mechanical skill. The community of trapped drivers has developed its own internal hierarchy and social structure, with veteran prisoners serving as informal leaders who help newcomers understand the unwritten rules of life at the eternal rest stop. These long-term residents discourage attempts to leave the facility, explaining that mechanical failures always become more severe when drivers try to resume their journeys. They've learned to find satisfaction in small accomplishments and minor repairs, rather than pursuing the impossible goal of returning to the outside world. Chester's conversation with the veteran drivers reveals the insidious nature of the psychological conditioning that affects everyone who remains at the truck stop for extended periods. The facility seems to gradually erode the drivers' connection to their previous lives, making them forget about delivery deadlines, family responsibilities, and professional obligations that once motivated their travel. The process is so subtle that most drivers don't realize they're losing interest in escape until they've already accepted their confinement as a natural state. Mildred Brennan represents the most extreme example of the psychological transformation that affects long-term residents of the truck stop. She's been stranded at the facility for what she estimates to be several months, though her perception of time seems unreliable and distorted. Mildred was originally hauling fresh produce from California to Chicago when her refrigerated trailer developed cooling problems that forced her to stop for emergency repairs. What should have been a quick fix has stretched into an indefinite stay as new mechanical problems develop faster than she can address them. Unlike the male drivers who maintain at least some interest in escape, Mildred seems genuinely content with her situation at the truck stop. She's taken on the role of unofficial social coordinator, organizing meal sharing and group activities that help maintain morale among the trapped drivers. Her acceptance of confinement is so complete that she actively discourages other drivers from attempting to leave, arguing that life at the truck stop is superior to the stress and uncertainty of highway transportation. "Why would you want to go back to that life?" Mildred asks Chester during one of their conversations in the convenience store's makeshift dining area. Constant pressure to meet deadlines, worrying about fuel costs and maintenance expenses, sleeping in different places every night. Here we have everything we need: food, shelter, companionship with people who understand our situation. It's like retirement, but without the financial worries. Mildred's contentment with her imprisonment disturbs Chester more than the obvious desperation of other trapped drivers. Her acceptance suggests that the truck stop's influence goes beyond mechanical sabotage to include psychological manipulation that makes confinement seem preferable to freedom. The facility appears to be designed not just to trap drivers physically, but to gradually erode their desire for escape until they become willing participants in their own captivity. The supernatural aspects of the truck stop become more apparent as Chester spends additional time observing the facility's operations and the behavior of its staff. Homer, the convenience store clerk, seems to work continuously without breaks or shift changes, maintaining the same tired but helpful demeanor regardless of the time of day or night. When Chester attempts to engage him in conversation about his work schedule or personal life, Homer's responses are vague and contradictory, as if he lacks memories or experiences outside the context of the truck stop. The facility's inventory replenishment occurs without any visible supply deliveries or vendor visits. Merchandise that disappears from the shelves during the day is mysteriously restocked during the night, but no one ever sees delivery trucks or supply personnel bringing in new inventory. The food service equipment continues to produce hot meals and coffee despite the absence of any apparent supply chain for ingredients and raw materials. The truck stop seems to operate as a closed system that generates its own resources through unknown means. Chester's attempts to understand the truck stop's history and origins lead him to examine the facility's construction and design for clues about its purpose and ownership. The building shows signs of hasty construction with structural elements that don't follow standard commercial building codes. The electrical and plumbing systems appear to be jury-rigged rather than professionally installed, as if the facility was built quickly to serve immediate needs rather than long-term operation. Most puzzling of all, the building lacks the permits, licenses, and regulatory compliance documentation that would be required for a legitimate commercial operation. The parking area's layout reinforces Chester's suspicions about the facility's supernatural nature. The spaces are arranged in a pattern that seems designed to maximize psychological isolation rather than operational efficiency. Trucks are positioned so that drivers can't easily communicate with each other or coordinate escape attempts. The lighting system creates pools of brightness separated by areas of deep shadow that make it difficult to maintain visual contact with other vehicles. The overall design suggests that the facility was built by entities who understand human psychology but lack experience with normal commercial operations. Chester's investigation of the surrounding area reveals additional disturbing information about the truck stop's location and its relationship to the normal world. According to his GPS system, the facility should be located in an area of open prairie with no nearby structures or services. Yet when he walks to the edge of the property, he can see lights in the distance that suggest other buildings and possibly a small town. However, attempts to reach these distant lights on foot result in a disorienting experience where the lights seem to recede as he approaches them, maintaining a constant distance regardless of how far he walks. The phenomenon suggests that the truck stop exists in a pocket dimension that's connected to, but separate from normal reality. The facility appears to be positioned at the intersection of multiple possible worlds, allowing it to draw drivers from the normal highway system while preventing them from returning to their original locations. The lights that seem to indicate nearby civilization may be images or reflections from other dimensions rather than actual destinations that can be reached by physical travel. Chester's growing understanding of the truck stop's supernatural nature is confirmed when he witnesses the arrival of a new victim during his second night at the facility. The approaching headlights belong to a recent model Peterbilt pulling a flatbed trailer loaded with construction equipment. The truck appears to be operating normally as it approaches the truck stop, but Chester watches in fascination as mechanical problems begin developing the moment the vehicle enters the facility's parking area. Steam begins rising from the Peterbilt's engine, even though the truck showed no signs of overheating while traveling at highway speeds. The driver, who introduces himself as Eugene Falkowski, seems genuinely surprised by his truck's sudden mechanical failure. His confusion and frustration mirror Chester's own experience from 2 days earlier, confirming that the facility actively creates problems for arriving vehicles to prevent their departure. The psychological impact of witnessing Eugene's entrapment forces Chester to confront the reality that he may never escape from the truck stop. The facility's ability to create mechanical problems on demand suggests that it possesses supernatural powers that can't be overcome through normal problem-solving techniques. The steady stream of new arrivals indicates that the trap operates continuously. Drawing victims from Chester's second week at the Eternal Rest Stop brings a deepening understanding of the facility's true nature and the supernatural forces that govern its operation. The initial shock of entrapment has given way to a more systematic analysis of the prison's mechanics, as Chester studies the patterns of behavior among both the trapped drivers and the facility's mysterious staff. His background in mechanical troubleshooting serves him well as he approaches his imprisonment as a problem to be solved rather than a fate to be accepted, though the solutions he seeks may lie beyond the realm of conventional engineering. The facility's daily rhythms reveal themselves to be far more complex than Chester initially understood. The supernatural energies that power the truck stop operate according to cycles that correspond to astronomical events rather than human schedules. During certain phases of the moon, the facility's ability to create and maintain mechanical failures seems to weaken slightly, providing brief windows of opportunity for escape attempts. Similarly, the behavior of the staff and the physical properties of the building itself fluctuate according to patterns that suggest the truck stop draws its power from cosmic sources that vary in strength over time. Chester begins documenting these cycles with the methodical precision of an engineer seeking to understand a complex system. He tracks the correlation between moon phases and mechanical failure rates, noting that trucks tend to develop fewer problems during the new moon and more severe malfunctions during the full moon. The facility's lighting system becomes more unstable during certain weather conditions, suggesting that atmospheric pressure and electromagnetic fields influence the supernatural forces that govern the truck stop's operation. The trapped driver's behavior also follows patterns that reveal important information about the facility's psychological conditioning methods. Newcomers typically progress through predictable stages of reaction to their imprisonment: initial denial and desperate repair attempts, followed by anger and frustrated escape efforts, then bargaining with the staff for special treatment or exceptions to the facility's rules, leading eventually to depression and acceptance of their fate. The drivers who have been confined for the longest periods show signs of a final stage beyond acceptance, a kind of supernatural integration where they become extensions of the facility itself. Mildred Brennan's transformation illustrates this final stage of psychological conditioning. During Chester's second week at the truck stop, he notices that she's beginning to exhibit some of the same strange characteristics that he's observed in Homer and the other staff members. Her conversations become increasingly repetitive and mechanical, following scripts rather than responding spontaneously to new information. Her physical appearance starts to show subtle changes, with her skin taking on the same waxy texture that Chester has noticed in the convenience store clerk. Most disturbing of all, she begins to actively sabotage other drivers' repair attempts, ensuring that their trucks remain inoperable. The realization that long-term confinement at the truck stop leads to transformation into something inhuman provides Chester with additional motivation for escape. The facility doesn't simply imprison its victims. It gradually converts them into agents of the supernatural force that controls the operation. The friendly community of trapped drivers represents various stages of this conversion process, with the most recently arrived maintaining their humanity, while the longest-term residents have already begun their metamorphosis into supernatural entities. Chester's systematic study of the facility reveals that the truck stop's power depends on maintaining a specific population of trapped drivers. When the number of prisoners falls below a certain threshold, the facility's ability to create mechanical problems and prevent escapes becomes noticeably weaker. Conversely, an overcrowded facility seems to strain the supernatural forces that maintain the prison, leading to occasional lapses in security that allow some drivers to escape. The optimal population appears to be between 15 and 20 drivers, a number that provides enough psychic energy to fuel the facility's operations without overwhelming its capacity for control. This discovery leads Chester to develop a strategy for weakening the truck stop's defenses by encouraging simultaneous escape attempts among multiple drivers. If enough prisoners try to leave at the same time, particularly during periods when the facility's power is naturally diminished, the supernatural forces might be unable to prevent all departures. The challenge lies in coordinating such an effort among drivers who have been psychologically conditioned to accept their imprisonment and discourage others from attempting escape. The social dynamics within the truck stop community make resistance organization extremely difficult. The drivers who have been confined for longer periods actively oppose escape attempts, viewing them as threats to the stability and security of their artificial community. They've developed emotional investments in their relationships with other prisoners and their roles within the truck stop's social hierarchy. The prospect of returning to the uncertain world of highway transportation seems less attractive than maintaining their current positions of relative comfort and companionship. Chester's attempts to build support for organized resistance meet with suspicion and hostility from the veteran prisoners. Mildred and the other long-term residents accuse him of being selfish and irresponsible for wanting to abandon the community they've worked to build. They argue that life at the truck stop is superior to the stress and isolation of long-haul trucking, and they present his desire for freedom as a form of mental illness that requires treatment rather than accommodation. The psychological warfare between Chester and the facility's converted agents becomes increasingly sophisticated as both sides adapt their strategies. The supernatural forces that control the truck stop begin using the long-term prisoners as intermediaries, working through them to undermine Chester's credibility and isolate him from potential allies. Dreams and nightmares become weapons in this battle, with Chester experiencing visions that are designed to erode his determination and make imprisonment seem preferable to the uncertainties of freedom. The facility's dream manipulation reveals another dimension of its supernatural capabilities. The truck stop can access and influence the subconscious minds of its prisoners, implanting false memories and artificial desires that support the conditioning process. Chester finds himself remembering conversations with family members that never occurred, in which his loved ones express relief that he's found a safe place to live and work. These fabricated memories are so convincing that they create genuine emotional conflicts about the wisdom of seeking escape. The battle for Chester's mind intensifies when the facility begins using his own professional identity against him. The truck stop creates scenarios where his mechanical expertise is desperately needed to help other drivers, making him feel indispensable to the community's welfare. Repair projects that should take hours stretch into days as new complications arise, keeping Chester occupied and invested in the facility's operations. The psychological satisfaction of solving complex mechanical problems becomes another form of conditioning that makes imprisonment seem preferable to freedom. Chester's resistance to these psychological manipulations depends on maintaining clear memories of his life before the truck stop and his reasons for seeking escape. He develops mental exercises and memory techniques that help him distinguish between genuine recollections and implanted experiences. The struggle to maintain his authentic identity becomes as important as any physical escape attempt, because psychological capitulation would make physical freedom meaningless, even if it could be achieved. The arrival of new prisoners provides Chester with opportunities to observe the conditioning process from the outside and to identify potential allies before they become fully integrated into the facility's community. Each newcomer represents a brief window of opportunity when resistance remains possible, before the psychological pressure and mechanical problems erode their determination to escape. Chester learns to recognize the signs of impending capitulation and to intervene with information and encouragement that might help maintain the new prisoner's resistance. However, the facility adapts to Chester's interference by accelerating the conditioning process for new arrivals. Drivers who might have taken weeks to accept their imprisonment are now subjected to more intensive psychological pressure that breaks down their resistance within days. The supernatural forces controlling the truck stop seem to learn from Chester's tactics and develop countermeasures that make successful resistance increasingly difficult. The escalating battle between Chester and the truck stop's supernatural forces reaches a critical point when he realizes that the facility has begun targeting him specifically for conversion into one of its agents. The mechanical problems with his truck become more severe and personal, as if the facility is trying to break his professional identity by destroying his competence as a driver and mechanic. The psychological pressure intensifies as well, with dreams and visions that attack his most fundamental beliefs about himself and his relationships with others. Chester understands that he's reached a point where further delay will make escape impossible. The facility's conditioning effects are cumulative and irreversible beyond a certain threshold, and he can feel himself beginning to experience the same psychological changes that have affected the long-term prisoners. His thoughts are becoming more mechanical and repetitive. His emotional responses are dulling, and his motivation for escape is weakening despite his rational understanding of the situation. The final phase of Chester's imprisonment brings a desperate race against time as he struggles to maintain his humanity while seeking a way to break free from the truck stop's supernatural control. The facility has revealed its true nature and abandoned any pretense of being a normal commercial operation, transforming into an openly hostile environment where the staff no longer bothers to maintain human appearances. The battle for Chester's soul has entered its final stage, and only his determination to retain his identity and freedom stands between him and permanent conversion into another agent of the eternal rest stop. Chester's final confrontation with the supernatural forces controlling the truck stop begins during the darkest hours before dawn on what he calculates to be his 15th day in captivity. The facility has abandoned all pretense of normal operation, revealing itself as a predatory entity that feeds on the life force and identity of professional drivers who have the misfortune to stop for assistance. The convenience store's fluorescent lights strobe erratically, casting writhing shadows that move independently of any physical objects, while the building's walls pulse with an organic rhythm that suggests the entire structure is alive and breathing. Homer and the other staff members no longer maintain their human facades, appearing as shifting amalgamations of previous drivers who have been consumed by the facility and reconstituted as its servants. Their faces flow and change like liquid, displaying fragments of identity from dozens of victims who have been absorbed into the truck stop's collective consciousness. When they speak, their voices carry harmonics and overtones that reveal the presence of multiple personalities struggling for expression within each transformed entity. The trapped drivers who have undergone partial conversion serve as extensions of the facility's will, working to prevent Chester's escape through a combination of physical restraint and psychological manipulation. Mildred leads this group with the fanatic devotion of someone who has found meaning and purpose in surrender to a higher power. Her transformation has progressed to the point where she no longer resembles the tired truck driver who arrived at the facility months earlier. She has become something hybrid, part human and part supernatural entity, with abilities and knowledge that extend beyond normal mortal limitations. "You don't understand what you're giving up," Mildred tells Chester as she blocks his path to the parking area where his truck sits waiting with engine running. Individual identity is just an illusion that causes suffering and isolation. Here we are part of something greater, something eternal. We have transcended the petty concerns of mortal existence and joined a consciousness that spans dimensions and timelines. Chester realizes that Mildred's transformation represents the final stage of the facility's conditioning process. The truck stop doesn't simply imprison drivers, it offers them a form of immortality in exchange for their individual consciousness. The entity that controls the facility feeds on human identity and agency, but it provides its victims with a sense of belonging and purpose that many find more attractive than the lonely uncertainties of independent existence. The philosophical battle between Chester and the converted drivers reveals the deeper nature of the truck stop's predatory methods. The facility exploits the isolation and alienation that characterize modern long-haul trucking, offering community and permanence to people who have spent their careers moving constantly between temporary destinations. The promise of eternal belonging proves more seductive than physical comfort or material rewards, creating willing participants in the process of spiritual consumption. Chester's resistance to this seduction depends on maintaining his commitment to values and relationships that exist outside the truck stop's artificial community. His memories of family, friends, and professional achievements serve as anchors that prevent his complete absorption into the facility's collective consciousness. The battle for his soul becomes a contest between the immediate gratification of supernatural belonging and his long-term commitment to human autonomy and individual responsibility. The facility's final assault on Chester's identity involves direct psychic attacks that attempt to overwhelm his consciousness with the combined mental force of all previously absorbed victims. He experiences their memories, emotions, and thoughts as if they were his own, creating a cacophony of competing identities that threaten to dissolve his sense of self. The psychological pressure is so intense that surrendering to the collective consciousness seems like the only way to escape the unbearable noise of overlapping personalities. Chester's survival of this psychic assault depends on techniques he's developed during his weeks of imprisonment for maintaining mental clarity and emotional stability. He focuses on specific memories and experiences that define his unique identity, using them as fixed points of reference that prevent his consciousness from being swept away by the tide of foreign thoughts and feelings. The discipline required for this mental defense is exhausting, but it allows him to maintain enough coherence to continue seeking physical escape. The breakthrough in Chester's understanding of the facility comes when he realizes that the truck stop's power depends on the willing participation of its victims in their own consumption. The supernatural entity cannot simply absorb unwilling consciousness. It requires some degree of consent or acceptance from its prey. The long conditioning process is designed to create this acceptance by making imprisonment seem preferable to freedom, but Chester's continued resistance has prevented the facility from completing its claim on his soul. This discovery provides Chester with a strategy for escape that goes beyond physical action to include spiritual resistance. By maintaining his absolute rejection of the facility's offer of supernatural community, he can weaken its power over him and create opportunities for departure. The challenge lies in sustaining this resistance while under constant psychological pressure designed to erode his determination and make capitulation seem like relief from unbearable suffering. Chester's escape attempt begins with systematic sabotage of the facility's infrastructure, targeting the electrical and mechanical systems that maintain the truck stop's operation. His background in diesel mechanics serves him well as he identifies vulnerabilities in the building's power grid and communication systems. By creating cascading failures in the facility's technology, he hopes to disrupt the supernatural forces that depend on these systems for maintaining their control over the physical environment. The facility responds to Chester's sabotage with increasingly desperate attempts to prevent his departure. The building itself becomes actively hostile, with doors that refuse to open, hallways that change configuration to prevent navigation, and floors that shift and buckle to impede movement. The converted staff and prisoners pursue Chester through the maze-like interior, their inhuman abilities allowing them to phase through solid barriers and appear in locations where they should not be able to reach. The chase through the supernatural truck stop reveals the full extent of the facility's otherworldly nature. Rooms expand and contract like living organs, walls breathe with visible rhythm, and the boundary between interior and exterior space becomes fluid and changeable. The building exists in multiple dimensions simultaneously, allowing the entity that controls it to manipulate space and time in ways that defy normal physical laws. Chester's mechanical knowledge becomes his salvation as he reaches his truck and discovers that the facility's supernatural interference with electronic systems has limits. While the entity can create mechanical failures and electrical malfunctions, it cannot completely override the basic physical principles that govern internal combustion engines. By bypassing the electronic control systems and operating his truck through purely mechanical means, Chester can reduce the facility's ability to prevent his departure. The final moments of Chester's escape involve a desperate race across the truck stop's parking area as the facility marshals all its supernatural power to prevent his departure. The pavement beneath his truck becomes soft and yielding, attempting to trap his wheels in supernatural quicksand. The air itself seems to thicken and resist his truck's forward motion, creating atmospheric pressure that his engine struggles to overcome. The other trapped drivers, now revealed as partially transformed hybrid entities, emerge from the building in pursuit of Chester's escaping truck. They move with inhuman speed and coordination, their bodies stretching and distorting as they attempt to reach his vehicle. Their faces display the desperate hunger of beings who understand that Chester's successful escape will weaken the collective consciousness they have joined, diminishing their own supernatural existence. Chester's truck finally breaks free from the facility's influence as he crosses some invisible boundary that marks the limits of the supernatural entity's power. The otherworldly truck stop immediately begins to fade and dissolve behind him, revealing itself to have been a temporary manifestation rather than a permanent structure. The building, the parking area, and even the other trapped drivers vanish like mirages, leaving only empty prairie under the pre-dawn sky. The return to normal reality is so abrupt and complete that Chester begins to question whether his experiences at the truck stop actually occurred or were elaborate hallucinations brought on by carbon monoxide poisoning or extreme fatigue. His truck's electronic systems show no record of the extended stop, and his GPS indicates that he has been traveling continuously along Interstate 80 without any significant delays. The cargo he was hauling remains secure and undamaged, as if no time has passed since his initial mechanical problems developed. However, the psychological changes Chester has undergone during his imprisonment provide evidence that his experiences were real rather than imaginary. His understanding of human nature and the dangers of isolation has been fundamentally altered by his encounter with the supernatural entity that preys on professional drivers. He has gained insights into the spiritual dimensions of highway travel that will influence his approach to trucking for the rest of his career. Chester's successful escape from the eternal rest stop leaves him with knowledge that he struggles to communicate to other drivers or to authorities who might be able to warn future victims. The facility's ability to appear and disappear according to the needs of its supernatural controller means that investigations will find no evidence of its existence. The entity has learned from Chester's resistance and will modify its tactics to prevent similar escapes in the future. The experience has taught Chester that the highways are populated by predatory forces that exploit the vulnerabilities of travelers who depend on roadside facilities for assistance and support. The isolation and independence that characterize professional trucking create ideal conditions for supernatural entities that seek to harvest human consciousness and identity. The battle between individual autonomy and collective absorption continues along America's highways, with truck drivers serving as unwitting soldiers in a war between competing definitions of existence and meaning. As Chester completes his delivery and returns to his normal routine, He carries with him the knowledge that freedom requires constant vigilance against forces that would trade spiritual autonomy for the illusion of security and belonging. The eternal rest stop represents one example of the supernatural snares that await travelers who are unprepared for the hidden dangers of the road, and Chester's escape has equipped him with the spiritual tools necessary to resist similar temptations in the future. Floyd's CB radio had been silent for hours when the first transmission crackled to life at exactly 4:17 a.m., pulling him from the meditative trance that often accompanied long stretches of night driving across New York's empty highways. The voice that emerged from his speaker was clear and professional, with the practiced cadence of someone who'd spent years communicating over CB radio channels. But there was something about the transmission that immediately caught Floyd's attention and made him reach for his microphone with a sense of unease he couldn't quite explain. Floyd Garrison had been hauling freight across the northeastern United States for 19 years, building his reputation as one of the most reliable independent operators in the region through a combination of mechanical expertise, route knowledge, and communication skills that made him a favorite among both shippers and fellow drivers. His 2016 Kenworth T680 was equipped with a high-quality CB radio system that he'd modified and upgraded over the years to provide maximum range and clarity, allowing him to maintain contact with other drivers across distances that standard equipment couldn't reach. The transmission that broke the pre-dawn silence was unlike anything Floyd had heard during nearly 2 decades of highway communication. The voice identified itself as northbound on 87, mile marker 73, but Floyd's own GPS showed him traveling southbound on Interstate 87 near that exact location, and his mirrors revealed no other trucks in either direction for miles. The speaker continued with a detailed traffic report that described accidents, construction delays, and road conditions with the kind of specific accuracy that could only come from direct observation. Yet the information contradicted everything Floyd could see through his windshield. "Heavy fog developing south of Albany," the mysterious voice reported. "Visibility dropping to maybe 50 feet in some spots. You southbound drivers better slow it down and watch for brake lights. I'm seeing a lot of four-wheelers getting bunched up and not maintaining safe following distance." Floyd checked his mirrors again and confirmed that the highway behind him was clear and dry, with visibility extending for miles in both directions under a star-filled sky. The weather conditions described in the transmission bore no resemblance to the actual environmental conditions he was experiencing. Yet the voice spoke with the confidence and authority of someone reporting first-hand observations. The discrepancy was so pronounced that Floyd began to wonder if he was somehow receiving transmissions from a different highway or perhaps a different time period entirely. The voice on the radio continued its traffic report for several more minutes, providing updates about specific vehicles and road hazards that Floyd couldn't verify through direct observation. The speaker mentioned seeing a blue Peterbilt with trailer problems at mile marker 68, and warned other drivers about a drunk driver weaving between lanes near the Saugerties exit. But Floyd's journey through these exact locations revealed no signs of the incidents being described. The highway remained empty and peaceful, contradicting the busy, hazardous conditions portrayed in the CB transmissions. Floyd's growing confusion about the phantom traffic reports prompted him to key his microphone and attempt to establish contact with the mysterious broadcaster. His years of CB radio experience had taught him the importance of verifying information before acting on it, and the contradictions between the reported conditions and his actual observations demanded investigation. "Northbound truck at mile marker 73. This is southbound Floyd at your same location. I'm not seeing any of the fog or traffic you're describing. What's your 20, good buddy?" The response came immediately, but it only deepened Floyd's confusion about the situation. The voice acknowledged his transmission with professional courtesy, providing a truck description and company affiliation that sounded legitimate. But when Floyd looked around for any vehicle matching the description, he found only empty highway stretching in both directions. The phantom broadcaster seemed to exist in the same physical space that Floyd occupied, yet somehow remained completely invisible to direct observation. "I'm running a white Freightliner Cascadia for tri-state transport," the voice replied. "Been watching you in my mirrors for the past few miles. You're maintaining good following distance, but you might want to start slowing down for this fog bank that's coming up fast." Floyd's speedometer showed him traveling at a steady 65 miles per hour, and his radar detector confirmed that no other vehicles were operating in his immediate vicinity. The tri-state transport company mentioned by the phantom broadcaster was familiar to Floyd. He'd seen their trucks many times over the years, but none were visible on the highway despite the speaker's claim to have been watching Floyd's truck for an extended period. The impossibility of the situation was becoming undeniable, forcing Floyd to confront the possibility that he was receiving transmissions from someone or something that existed outside normal physical reality. The phenomenon intensified as Floyd continued his southbound journey, with additional voices joining the Phantom Traffic Report Network to provide updates and warnings about road conditions that contradicted Floyd's direct observations. The transmissions were remarkably detailed and consistent, describing a version of Interstate 87 that was populated with heavy traffic, dangerous weather, and multiple accidents requiring emergency response. The Phantom drivers communicated with each other using proper CB radio protocols and terminology, discussing fuel stops, delivery schedules, and mechanical problems with the casual familiarity of professional colleagues. What made the transmissions particularly unsettling was their interactive nature. The Phantom drivers seemed aware of Floyd's presence and occasionally directed comments specifically to him, providing advice about route selection and warnings about hazards that didn't exist in his version of reality. They spoke as if they could see his truck and monitor his driving, yet Floyd's careful observation of his surroundings revealed no evidence of other vehicles or the dangerous conditions being described on the radio. The psychological impact of receiving detailed, consistent misinformation about his immediate environment began to affect Floyd's confidence in his own perceptions. The Phantom drivers spoke with such authority and conviction that he found himself second-guessing his visual observations and wondering if he might be missing important details about road conditions ahead. The experience created a form of cognitive dissonance, where his CB radio and his eyes provided completely contradictory information about the same stretch of highway. Floyd's attempt to make sense of the phantom transmissions led him to consider various rational explanations for the phenomenon. He wondered if atmospheric conditions might be causing him to receive CB radio signals from distant locations, creating the illusion of local traffic that was actually occurring hundreds of miles away. He checked his radio settings and antenna connections, looking for technical problems that might explain the mysterious broadcasts, but his equipment appeared to be functioning normally. The possibility of mechanical malfunction seemed less likely as the phantom transmissions continued with remarkable consistency and detail. The voices described specific mile markers, exit numbers, and geographic features that corresponded exactly to Floyd's current location on Interstate 87. The information was too accurate and location-specific to be explained by random radio interference or equipment failure. Something was deliberately broadcasting false information about traffic conditions, and Floyd was apparently the intended recipient of these deceptive communications. As dawn approached and Floyd continued receiving phantom traffic reports, a new voice joined the CB radio conversation that would change his understanding of the phenomenon entirely. The speaker identified herself as Velma Patterson, claiming to be a veteran truck driver with more than 20 years of experience hauling freight across the northeastern United States. Her voice carried the authority and expertise that Floyd associated with seasoned professionals, but her initial transmission contained information that challenged everything he thought he understood about time and space.
"Floyd, I know you're confused about what you're hearing on the radio," Velma's voice said, addressing him directly despite the fact that he'd never identified himself by name during his transmissions. You're receiving broadcasts from drivers who died on this stretch of highway over the years. We're trying to help you avoid the accidents that claimed our lives. The revelation that the phantom traffic reports were coming from deceased truck drivers forced Floyd to reconsider everything he'd experienced during the past several hours. The detailed knowledge of road conditions, the professional familiarity with CB radio protocols, and the apparent ability to observe his truck's position suddenly made sense if the broadcasters were spirits of drivers who had died along this route and continued to monitor highway traffic from beyond the grave. Velma's explanation of the phenomenon provided a framework for understanding the phantom transmissions that was both terrifying and strangely comforting. According to her account, the spirits of truck drivers who had died in accidents along Interstate 87 continued to patrol the highway, using CB radio frequencies to warn living drivers about dangerous conditions and potential hazards. Their traffic reports described not current conditions, but rather the circumstances that had existed at the times of their own deaths, creating a temporal echo that overlaid past events onto present reality. "The fog I was warning you about killed me back in 1987, one of the phantom drivers explained when Floyd asked for more details about their situation. "Multi-car pileup just south of Albany during a sudden weather change. I've been trying to warn other drivers about that same fog bank ever since, hoping to prevent someone else from making the same mistake I made." The tragic stories shared by the phantom drivers revealed Interstate 87 to be a highway haunted by the spirits of professional truckers who had lost their lives to accidents, mechanical failures, and medical emergencies over the decades since the road's construction. Each ghost continued to broadcast warnings about the specific hazards that had claimed their lives, creating a supernatural traffic information network designed to protect living drivers from similar fates. Floyd realized that his CB radio had somehow become tuned to this ghostly frequency, allowing him to receive communications from drivers who existed in a parallel dimension where their final journeys continued indefinitely. The phantom traffic reports represented their ongoing attempts to complete their professional duties, serving other drivers by providing safety information even after death had ended their earthly careers. The discovery that he was communicating with deceased truck drivers transformed Floyd's understanding of his profession and the highways he traveled. The roads that had seemed like simple transportation infrastructure were revealed to be corridors where the living and the dead intersected, with ghostly drivers continuing to serve their fellow professionals long after their physical presence had been removed from the highway system. Velma Patterson's ghostly presence on the CB radio becomes Floyd's primary source of information about the supernatural communication network that operates along Interstate 87, connecting the spirits of deceased truck drivers with living professionals who possess the sensitivity to receive their transmissions. Unlike the other phantom broadcasters who seem trapped in endless loops of repeating their final traffic reports, Velma demonstrates awareness of current conditions and the ability to engage in real-time conversation about topics that extend beyond the circumstances of her own death. According to Velma's account, she died in a jackknife accident during an ice storm in 1993, when her truck lost control on a bridge approach that had been inadequately treated with road salt. Her trailer swung sideways across multiple lanes of traffic, causing a chain reaction collision that claimed the lives of 3 other drivers and left wreckage scattered across the highway for more than a mile. The accident investigation revealed that state maintenance crews had failed to properly prepare the roadway for the forecasted weather conditions, but the administrative failures that contributed to the disaster were never acknowledged publicly or corrected systematically. Velma's spirit has spent the 31 years since her death monitoring weather conditions along Interstate 87, broadcasting warnings about ice formation and dangerous surface conditions that might cause accidents similar to the one that claimed her life. Her ghostly traffic reports focus specifically on winter driving hazards, providing detailed information about temperature variations, wind patterns, and precipitation that could create treacherous road conditions.
Living drivers who receive her transmissions often report avoiding accidents during severe weather events, though most remain unaware that their safety warnings came from a deceased colleague. The supernatural communication network that Velma describes operates according to rules and limitations that reflect the circumstances of each driver's death and their level of spiritual evolution since crossing into the realm of the dead. Drivers who died suddenly in accidents often remain trapped in temporal loops, endlessly repeating their final radio transmissions and reliving the moments leading up to their fatal crashes. These spirits provide consistent but limited information, broadcasting the same warnings about specific hazards without adapting their messages to current conditions or responding to communications from living drivers. More evolved spirits like Velma have progressed beyond the compulsive repetition of their death experiences and developed the ability to observe current highway conditions, interact with living drivers, and provide real-time assistance with navigation and safety decisions. These advanced ghosts serve as mentors and guides for newly deceased drivers, helping them understand their spiritual situation and teaching them how to use CB radio frequencies to continue serving their professional community despite their physical absence from the highway system. The spiritual hierarchy among deceased truck drivers mirrors the social structure that exists within the living professional community, with veteran drivers who had extensive experience and strong reputations during their lifetimes assuming leadership roles in the ghostly communication network. These elder spirits coordinate the activities of less experienced ghosts, assign monitoring responsibilities for specific highway segments, and establish protocols for interacting with living drivers who demonstrate sensitivity to supernatural communications. Floyd's growing understanding of the Phantom CB radio network reveals that his ability to receive transmissions from deceased drivers represents a rare gift that occurs in only a small percentage of professional truckers. According to Velma, the sensitivity required for spiritual communication develops gradually over years of highway driving, emerging most strongly in drivers who have experienced near-death encounters or who possess natural psychic abilities that make them receptive to otherworldly phenomena. Floyd's 19 years of professional trucking have apparently prepared him to serve as a bridge between the living and the dead, facilitating communication that serves the safety interests of both spiritual realms. The responsibility of serving as a medium between worlds carries psychological and spiritual challenges that Floyd wasn't prepared for when his CB radio first began receiving phantom transmissions. The constant awareness of death and tragedy that pervades the ghostly communication network creates emotional stress that affects his ability to enjoy the solitary peace he'd previously found in long-distance driving. Every mile marker and bridge approach becomes a potential site of fatal accidents, and every weather change brings reminders of the hazards that have claimed the lives of his deceased colleagues. Velma's guidance helps Floyd develop coping strategies for managing the psychological impact of his supernatural communication abilities. She explains that living drivers who serve as mediums for ghostly traffic networks often experience periods of depression and anxiety as they become aware of the dangers and tragedies that surround highway transportation. The key to maintaining mental health lies in focusing on the positive aspects of the phenomenon. The lives saved through supernatural safety warnings and the comfort provided to grieving families who receive messages from deceased loved ones. The educational process that Velma provides about the spiritual dimensions of trucking includes detailed explanations of how different types of accidents create different categories of highway ghosts. Drivers who die in collisions often become trapped in loops of reliving their final moments, broadcasting emergency warnings that reflect their desperate attempts to avoid disaster. Those who succumb to medical emergencies while driving tend to become protective spirits who monitor the health and well-being of living drivers, providing warnings about fatigue, stress, and physical symptoms that might lead to similar tragedies. Mechanical failures that result in fatal accidents create ghosts who focus obsessively on equipment maintenance and safety inspections, broadcasting detailed information about potential mechanical problems and urging living drivers to perform preventive maintenance that might prevent similar failures. These mechanical spirits often possess supernatural knowledge about truck systems and components, providing diagnostic information that exceeds the expertise they demonstrated during their physical lifetimes. The most tragic category of highway ghosts, according to Velma, consists of drivers who died as a result of violence or criminal activity along the highways. These spirits often become vengeful entities who use CB radio transmissions to hunt for their killers or to warn other drivers about dangerous locations where criminal activity frequently occurs. Their communications tend to be more disturbing and emotionally intense than those of other ghostly broadcasters, reflecting the traumatic circumstances of their deaths and their ongoing desire for justice or revenge. Floyd's education about the various types of highway spirits prepares him for encounters with different categories of ghostly communications, each requiring different responses and levels of caution. Some phantom transmissions provide helpful safety information that should be taken seriously and acted upon immediately. Others represent the confused ramblings of spirits who remain disoriented by their death experiences and may provide inaccurate or misleading information. The most dangerous communications come from malevolent entities who use CB radio frequencies to lure living drivers into traps or to spread fear and confusion that could lead to accidents. The process of distinguishing between helpful and harmful supernatural communications becomes one of Floyd's primary concerns as he continues to receive phantom transmissions during his regular freight runs along Interstate 87. Velma teaches him to evaluate the content, tone, and consistency of ghostly broadcasts, looking for indicators that suggest whether the information comes from benevolent spirits seeking to help living drivers or from malicious entities with destructive intentions. The ability to make these distinctions accurately becomes crucial for Floyd's safety and for his effectiveness as a medium between the living and the dead. The supernatural education that Velma provides extends beyond practical safety considerations to include philosophical and spiritual insights about the nature of death and the continuation of consciousness after physical demise. According to her teachings, the boundary between life and death is far more permeable than most people understand, particularly along highways where the constant movement of travelers creates conditions that facilitate communication between different planes of existence. The CB radio frequency spectrum serves as a kind of spiritual telephone system that allows consciousness to persist and communicate across dimensional boundaries. Velma's explanations of the afterlife for truck drivers reveal a cosmology where professional identity and dedication to service continue beyond physical death, creating a supernatural support network that mirrors the mutual assistance culture that characterizes the living trucking community. Deceased drivers who maintain their commitment to helping others are able to continue serving their profession through ghostly communications, while those who become bitter or resentful about their deaths may become trapped in cycles of anger and revenge that prevent their spiritual evolution. The growing relationship between Floyd and Velma develops into a mentoring partnership that provides both practical benefits and emotional support for Floyd's role as a spiritual medium. Velma's decades of experience as a highway ghost have given her insights into the supernatural aspects of trucking that no living driver could possess, and her willingness to share this knowledge helps Floyd navigate the complex world of phantom communications more safely and effectively. As Floyd becomes more comfortable with his supernatural communication abilities, he begins to understand that his role extends beyond simply receiving ghostly transmissions to include serving as an active participant in the spiritual support network that operates along America's highways. Living drivers who can communicate with deceased colleagues become valuable resources for both the living and the dead, facilitating information exchange that benefits the entire professional community and helps maintain the bonds of mutual assistance that define trucking culture. Floyd's third week of receiving phantom CB radio transmissions brings an encounter with Melvin Kowalski, a ghostly trucker whose supernatural communications reveal the darker aspects of the highway spirit network, and challenge Floyd's growing comfort with his role as a medium between the living and the dead. Melvin's spirit broadcasts from mile marker 91 on Interstate 87, where he died in 1979 when his truck was struck by a drunk driver who crossed the median during the early morning hours, creating a head-on collision that killed both men instantly and scattered debris across multiple lanes of traffic for more than half a mile. Unlike Velma Patterson's helpful traffic reports and safety warnings, Melvin's phantom transmissions carry an undertone of anger and resentment that makes them disturbing to receive and difficult to interpret accurately. His ghostly voice crackles with electronic interference that seems to increase when his emotional intensity rises, creating audio distortions that suggest his spiritual energy is less stable and controlled than that of more evolved highway ghosts. The content of his broadcasts focuses obsessively on drunk driving and impaired motorists, with detailed descriptions of suspected intoxicated drivers that often prove to be inaccurate when Floyd attempts to verify them through direct observation. Melvin's first contact with Floyd occurs during a routine southbound run, when the ghost's voice suddenly interrupts a conversation between Floyd and Velma with urgent warnings about a weaving vehicle that supposedly poses an immediate threat to traffic safety. According to Melvin's frantic transmission, a pickup truck with 2 occupants is traveling erratically in the northbound lanes, crossing lane markers and showing classic signs of driver impairment. The ghost's description includes specific details about the vehicle's color, license plate number, and the physical appearance of its occupants, information that seems impossible for a disembodied spirit to obtain through normal observation methods. Floyd's attempt to locate the dangerous vehicle described in Melvin's transmission reveals the first indication that this particular highway ghost may not be providing reliable information. Despite Melvin's insistence that the impaired driver is creating immediate hazards for other motorists, Floyd's careful observation of the northbound traffic lanes reveals only normal vehicles traveling at appropriate speeds and maintaining proper lane position. The pickup truck that Melvin describes in vivid detail is nowhere to be seen, despite the ghost's claim that it should be visible from Floyd's current position. The discrepancy between Melvin's urgent warnings and Floyd's direct observations creates confusion about how to respond to supernatural communications that may be inaccurate or deliberately misleading. Velma's explanation of the phenomenon reveals that some highway ghosts become fixated on the circumstances of their own deaths in ways that distort their perception of current road conditions. Melvin's obsession with drunk driving has apparently caused him to see impaired motorists everywhere, leading to false reports that reflect his psychological trauma rather than actual traffic hazards. The problem of unreliable, ghostly informants represents a significant challenge for Floyd's role as a spiritual medium, requiring him to develop skills for evaluating the credibility and accuracy of supernatural communications before acting on them or relaying them to other living drivers. Melvin's false reports about drunk drivers could potentially cause Floyd to take unnecessary evasive actions or to broadcast warnings that might create panic among other truckers monitoring CB radio channels. The responsibility for filtering and verifying phantom transmissions adds a layer of complexity to Floyd's supernatural communication duties that he hadn't anticipated when his CB radio first began receiving ghostly broadcasts. Velma's coaching about dealing with problematic highway spirits includes detailed explanations of the psychological processes that affect ghosts who remain traumatized by the circumstances of their deaths. According to her teaching, spirits like Melvin often become trapped in repetitive cycles of reliving their fatal accidents, causing them to perceive current road conditions through the lens of their own tragic experiences. These trauma-affected ghosts genuinely believe they are providing helpful safety information, but their perceptions are so distorted by emotional damage that their reports often bear little resemblance to actual highway conditions. The challenge of managing Melvin's disruptive broadcasts becomes more complex when Floyd realizes that the troubled ghost's transmissions are affecting other drivers who possess varying degrees of sensitivity to supernatural communications. Several living truckers begin reporting encounters with the drunk driver that Melvin has been describing, creating a form of collective hallucination where multiple people start seeing hazards that exist only in the ghost's traumatized imagination. The phenomenon demonstrates how supernatural misinformation can spread through the trucking community's communication network, creating real safety hazards based on false spiritual intelligence. Floyd's attempts to calm Melvin's agitated broadcasts and redirect his energy toward more constructive activities meet with limited success, as the ghost's psychological fixation on drunk driving has become so deeply ingrained that it defines his entire spiritual existence. Melvin's identity as a highway ghost is built around his role as a sentinel against impaired driving, and any attempt to question the accuracy of his reports triggers defensive responses that increase the intensity of his electromagnetic interference with CB radio communications. The ghost's emotional instability creates technical problems that affect the clarity of all supernatural transmissions in his vicinity, interfering with the helpful communications provided by more reliable spiritual broadcasters. The situation with Melvin deteriorates further when Floyd discovers that the ghost has begun targeting specific living drivers with accusations of intoxication based on minor variations in their driving patterns. A trucker named Eugene Carlson becomes the focus of Melvin's attention when his truck swerves slightly to avoid road debris, triggering the ghost's suspicion that Eugene is driving under the influence of alcohol or drugs. Melvin's increasingly aggressive broadcasts about Eugene's supposed impairment begin to affect other drivers' perceptions, creating a dangerous situation where multiple truckers start treating Eugene as a hazardous driver despite his normal and professional behavior. Floyd's intervention on Eugene's behalf requires him to use his authority as a spiritual medium to challenge Melvin's accusations and defend an innocent driver from supernatural harassment. The confrontation reveals the extent to which highway ghosts can influence the perceptions and behaviors of living drivers, creating social dynamics within the trucking community that reflect the psychological states of deceased colleagues. Melvin's trauma-induced paranoia about drunk driving has the potential to spread through the spiritual communication network, affecting multiple living drivers and creating real safety hazards based on false supernatural intelligence. The conflict between Floyd and Melvin escalates when the ghost accuses Floyd himself of being corrupted or compromised in some way that prevents him from recognizing obvious signs of driver impairment. According to Melvin's increasingly paranoid worldview, Floyd's defense of Eugene and his questioning of the ghost's reports indicate that he's either failing in his duties as a spiritual medium or actively collaborating with dangerous drivers to conceal their impaired condition. The accusation forces Floyd to confront the possibility that his role as a bridge between the living and the dead might sometimes require him to oppose supernatural entities whose intentions are harmful despite their claimed desire to protect highway safety. Velma's support during Floyd's confrontation with Melvin reveals the existence of a spiritual hierarchy among highway ghosts that allows more evolved spirits to intervene when troubled entities become disruptive or dangerous. According to Velma's explanation, experienced ghosts like herself have the authority to limit or redirect the communications of spirits whose psychological problems interfere with the beneficial work of the supernatural highway safety network. The process of spiritual intervention requires careful application of ghostly authority to avoid triggering defensive reactions that might make the problematic spirit even more disruptive. The resolution of the Melvin crisis involves a coordinated effort by multiple highway ghosts to contain his disruptive broadcasts and redirect his obsessive energy toward more constructive activities. Velma organizes a group of veteran spirits to provide Melvin with therapeutic support, designed to help him process his trauma and develop more accurate perceptions of current road conditions. The intervention succeeds in reducing the intensity of Melvin's false reports, though he continues to struggle with psychological issues that occasionally cause relapses into paranoid behavior. Floyd's experience with Melvin's troubled spirit teaches him important lessons about the complexity of supernatural communication and the potential dangers of relying too heavily on ghostly informants without independent verification. The incident demonstrates that death doesn't automatically confer wisdom or reliability, and that highway ghosts can be affected by the same psychological problems that troubled them during their physical lifetimes. The responsibility for evaluating and filtering supernatural communications becomes a crucial skill for anyone who serves as a medium between the living and the dead. The aftermath of the Melvin incident brings changes to the highway ghost communication network that improve its reliability and reduce the potential for disruption by troubled spirits. Velma and the other senior ghosts implement protocols for monitoring and mentoring newly deceased drivers, helping them adapt to their spiritual condition without developing the psychological fixations that made Melvin a problematic broadcaster. The improvements in spiritual organization create a more stable and trustworthy supernatural highway safety system that better serves both living and deceased members of the trucking community. Floyd's growing expertise in managing supernatural communications leads to his recognition as a valuable resource within the highway ghost network, with spirits seeking his assistance in resolving conflicts and coordinating activities that benefit the entire community. His role as a spiritual medium evolves beyond simply receiving ghostly transmissions to include active participation in the organization and management of supernatural highway safety operations, making him a crucial link between the living and the dead in the ongoing effort to reduce accidents and save lives on America's highways. Floyd's final transformation into a master spiritual medium occurs during a crisis that tests every skill he's developed during months of communicating with highway ghosts and threatens to destroy the supernatural safety network that has evolved along Interstate 87. The emergency begins when a massive winter storm system develops over the northeastern United States, creating conditions that intensify supernatural activity while simultaneously making highway travel extremely dangerous for living drivers who lack access to otherworldly weather intelligence. The storm's approach triggers unprecedented activity among the highway ghost network, with dozens of deceased drivers attempting to broadcast warnings simultaneously, creating a cacophony of overlapping transmissions that makes individual communications nearly impossible to understand. The electromagnetic interference generated by multiple agitated spirits overwhelms CB radio frequencies, producing static and distortion that prevents effective coordination between living and dead truckers during the period when their cooperation is most desperately needed. Velma Patterson's voice cuts through the supernatural chaos with urgent appeals for Floyd to use his authority as the primary living medium to organize and coordinate the ghostly communications. According to her assessment, the approaching storm represents the most dangerous weather system to affect the region in decades, with conditions that could easily produce accidents similar to those that killed many of the highway spirits who are now trying to warn living drivers about the impending hazards. Floyd, we need you to take charge of this situation. Velma's transmission crackles through heavy static. Every ghost on this highway is trying to broadcast warnings at the same time, and nobody can hear anything useful through all the interference. You're the only one who can bring order to this chaos and make sure the living drivers get the information they need to survive this storm. The responsibility for organizing a supernatural emergency response network forces Floyd to draw upon leadership skills he'd never known he possessed, as he works to establish communication protocols that allow dozens of highway ghosts to share critical weather intelligence without creating signal interference that renders their warnings useless. The task requires him to understand the psychological motivations and traumatic histories of individual spirits, using that knowledge to assign specific roles and responsibilities that utilize each ghost's expertise while minimizing conflicts and overlapping transmissions. The storm's arrival brings conditions that validate the supernatural warnings while demonstrating the life-saving value of the ghostly communication network. Blinding snow squalls develop exactly where deceased drivers had predicted, based on their memories of similar weather patterns that had contributed to their own fatal accidents. Ice formation occurs precisely at locations where spirits had warned about temperature variations and surface conditions that create hazardous driving environments. The accuracy of the supernatural weather intelligence proves that highway ghosts possess observational abilities that exceed those of living meteorologists and traffic management systems. Floyd's coordination of the spiritual response network allows living drivers to navigate the storm with information and guidance that would otherwise be impossible to obtain. Ghostly spotters positioned along the entire length of Interstate 87 provide real-time updates about changing conditions, accident locations, and safe alternative routes that help dozens of truckers avoid potentially fatal encounters with the storm system. The supernatural early warning system proves its value by preventing multiple accidents that would likely have occurred without otherworldly intelligence about rapidly developing hazards. The success of the ghostly storm response network demonstrates the potential benefits of formal cooperation between living and dead members of the trucking community. But it also reveals the psychological toll that spiritual mediumship places on Floyd's mental and emotional health. The constant awareness of death and tragedy that characterizes communication with highway ghosts creates a form of chronic stress that affects his ability to enjoy the aspects of trucking that originally attracted him to the profession. The peaceful solitude of long-distance driving has been replaced by continuous supernatural responsibility that makes rest and relaxation nearly impossible. Velma's recognition of Floyd's burnout leads to discussions about the long-term sustainability of his role as the primary spiritual medium for Interstate 87's highway ghost network. According to her observations, living drivers who serve as bridges between worlds typically experience career transitions that reflect their evolving relationship with supernatural phenomena. Some become so absorbed in spiritual communication that they lose interest in physical trucking and seek careers in paranormal research or counseling. Others develop techniques for limiting their supernatural involvement while maintaining enough sensitivity to serve as emergency contacts during crisis situations. The question of Floyd's future relationship with the highway ghost network becomes more urgent when he begins experiencing physical symptoms that suggest his spiritual activities are affecting his health in measurable ways. Extended periods of intense supernatural communication leave him exhausted and disoriented, with headaches and sleep disturbances that interfere with his ability to meet the physical demands of professional trucking. The electromagnetic interference generated by multiple ghostly transmissions seems to affect his nervous system in ways that create lasting fatigue and concentration problems. Floyd's growing health concerns force him to establish boundaries around his spiritual mediumship activities, limiting his availability for supernatural communications to emergency situations while maintaining enough involvement to preserve his relationships with key highway ghosts like Velma. The process of reducing his supernatural responsibilities while retaining his ability to serve as a spiritual medium requires careful negotiation with the Ghost Network's leadership and the development of backup communication protocols for situations when Floyd is unavailable. The resolution of Floyd's role within the Highway Ghost Network involves his evolution into a mentor for other living drivers who demonstrate sensitivity to supernatural communications. His experience with spiritual mediumship provides him with unique insights into the challenges and rewards of serving as a bridge between worlds, knowledge that he can share with newcomers to help them develop their abilities more safely and effectively. The transition from active medium to spiritual advisor allows Floyd to maintain his connections to the Ghost Network while reducing the health risks associated with intensive supernatural communication. The establishment of multiple spiritual mediums along Interstate 87 creates a more resilient and sustainable supernatural safety network. that doesn't depend on any single living driver for its operation. Floyd's training of backup mediums ensures that the Highway Ghost Network can continue providing valuable safety services even if individual participants become unavailable due to health problems, career changes, or other life transitions. The distributed approach to spiritual communication reduces the psychological and physical burden on any one person while improving the overall reliability of supernatural highway safety operations. Floyd's legacy within the highway ghost community extends beyond his direct contributions to supernatural communication to include his role in establishing protocols and procedures that improve the effectiveness of spiritual safety networks. His documentation of successful mediumship techniques and his analysis of common problems faced by living drivers who communicate with highway ghosts create resources that benefit future generations of spiritual mediums and the deceased drivers they serve. The long-term impact of Floyd's involvement with Interstate 87's Highway Ghost Network influences his entire approach to professional trucking and his understanding of the relationships between living and dead members of the trucking community. His awareness of the spiritual dimensions of highway travel makes him more conscious of safety considerations and more respectful of the traditions and culture that connect current drivers to their deceased colleagues. The knowledge that highway ghosts continue to serve and protect their living counterparts creates a sense of continuity and purpose that transcends individual careers and lifetimes. As Floyd continues his trucking career with reduced but ongoing involvement in supernatural communications, he carries with him the understanding that death doesn't end the bonds of mutual assistance and professional solidarity that define trucking culture. The Highway Ghost Network represents the ultimate expression of the trucker's commitment to helping fellow drivers, with deceased colleagues continuing to provide safety warnings and emergency assistance long after their physical presence has been removed from the highways they once traveled. The transformation of Floyd's relationship with his profession reflects the broader impact that awareness of supernatural highway phenomena can have on living drivers who possess the sensitivity to perceive otherworldly activity. The knowledge that highways are populated by the spirits of deceased truckers who continue to serve their profession creates responsibilities and opportunities that extend far beyond the simple transportation of freight from one location to another. The roads become sacred spaces where the living and the dead intersect in service of safety, community, and the preservation of professional traditions that connect generations of drivers. Floyd's experience with the Highway Ghost Network ultimately teaches him that trucking is more than just a career. It's a calling that connects individuals to a larger community that transcends the boundaries between life and death. The spirits of deceased drivers who continue to broadcast safety warnings and provide emergency assistance demonstrate the enduring nature of the commitment that professional truckers make to protecting and serving their colleagues. The supernatural communication network that operates along America's highways represents the ultimate expression of the mutual aid culture that has always defined the trucking profession. As Floyd's story concludes, he remains connected to both the living and dead members of the trucking community, serving as a bridge between worlds while pursuing his career as a freight hauler. His CB radio continues to receive occasional transmissions from highway ghosts, but he's learned to manage his supernatural responsibilities in ways that preserve his health and well-being while honoring his commitment to the spiritual safety network that protects travelers along Interstate 87. The balance he's achieved between his physical and spiritual duties creates a sustainable approach to mediumship that allows him to serve both dimensions of the trucking community throughout his career.